And this is just the beginning. You just watch yourself.
We have formed an alliance.
We have formed an alliance. Name a kid that didn't grow up watching Indiana Jones and, we're inspired by it. I mean, we're practically sitting with them right now,
A lot of the public has been primed to distrust us, right? Mm-hmm. And so the only way to really combat that is not to go out and fight these people and debunk them. And what we need to do is build a stronger online community than they have built.
Yes. Lack of accountability and no accountability mechanisms in alternative media means you can just lie about everything, and it never really comes back to bite you.
If you go read Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis book, and then you go read Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods, you're going to see immediately how one is derivative of the other. When in fact, we dig down to bedrock, where we can't dig any lower.
There's a glitch to get through bedrock. How do you decide what is appropriate to place in a museum, or how do you feel about museums?
Ooh. I'll let you start with that one.
Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to a special roundtable edition at the Rectangle Table. We're joined today by Flint and Milo, who have been previous guests of the show, and they are here to talk to us about archaeology, debunking, pseudo-archaeology, and other things relating to online content creation in an educational sphere while also dealing with misinformation. Welcome.
Thank you for having us back.
Yeah, good to be here. I'm excited to be at this rectangular round table. Thank you for having us again.
That's how we'd probably describe it archaeologically too. It's curvilinear.
What is curvilinear?
That's a really important
You're allowed to
term.
make jokes. If you guys are both laughing and neither of us are laughing, okay? Explain the joke.
Well, you have things that are linear, but they have curves to them because people don't always, they build things in a wonky way. Because, people in the past were not always perfect in how they built stuff. And so we call walls curvilinear when they're kind of like a straight line, but they also curve.
Okay. All right. I want to ask you, now that I have both of you here, okay, I need to ask you archaeological questions I've always wondered about, okay?
Uh-oh.
Here we go.
I don't have an answer.
Lay it on us.
Where was Jesus buried? Why don't we have his body? No, I'm just kidding. No. Actually, here's a question. A lot of times there is old stuff found, and people will make the claim that these people knew how to build concrete in a special way, that we've this lost technology, they had a thing figured out, we've lost it, and now we've rediscovered it, or something like that. Has that ever been the case, that there was some building material or some type of construction thing where there was lost technology that for some reason 2,000 years ago people knew how to do a thing that modern people just didn't understand? Is there, yeah.
I don't know about not being able to understand it, but what you're thinking about is Roman concrete. Mm-hmm. And so the reason is that Roman concrete is actually more durable than modern concrete because it's made in a different way. They actually use volcanic soil. It's called pozzolana. And that's why Roman concrete is still around, but our concrete would never last 2,000 years. We do it in this sort of modern way that just it's not durable. And so it actually was a recent publication, I think just 5 years ago, that was looking into why that's the case. But I don't think that technique was ever forgotten, if you see what I mean. It's just we found a cheaper, more affordable way to do it with materials that were more readily available rather than having to get volcanic soil.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the things that is kind of annoying when people talk about things being good or bad is oftentimes people don't include that whether something is good or bad is a function of how easy it is to create or the cost as well. Like what's better, like a steak at a $200 a night steakhouse or a steak from Denny's. And it's like, well, I mean, it depends. Like the steak from Denny's is $9, so you get what you pay for, right? But okay, I was curious because I hear that's like a thing I hear a lot. The concrete thing was one example. I can't think of any in particular, but sometimes you hear there was the lost building techniques that no one has known how to do anymore.
The stone cutting specifically. I know it comes up in pseudo-archaeology all the time, which is like that. There's a specific block that has a partial cut into it, and they're like, why would they have...
Is it the sarcophagus, the Egyptian sarcophagus?
Yeah, I think the TikToker talks about this a lot, and it's like, why if it takes so long to cut into, did they cut the full way into it and stuff like that, which is I have no idea.
And I think that the funny argument with that one is, I think the argument sort of goes, so it's a sarcophagus where there's a cut through it and they didn't finish it, and it's a little bit off the guideline, and so they're like, how did they make it this far before they clocked that mistake? If they were really doing it as slowly as archaeologists say they would, wouldn't they have seen this sooner? regardless of how stupid that is, the thing that I think is the most, interesting about that is if they did have some sort of lost high technology, power tools, something like that, they could have just done the cut again. Like, that's even less evidence that they would have stopped, Like, if I had a diamond-tipped buzzsaw, I would have just been like, all right, damn, like, line this thing back up, we missed that one, zing, and like, there you go, the sarcophagus is done. So when you're working on something that slowly, and I can't speculate as to why they abandoned the cut, but it's interesting looking at things like that because we really try and project what our modern capabilities are onto ancient people, which is just an inappropriate way of doing it because they did have different technology than we do.
And I think that's what's forgotten, is how to just do stuff in a traditional way.
Yes, well said.
And so we live in this modern world and we're like, how could people move a giant block? Well, look, I work on excavations and the people I work with, we have to move giant blocks by hand out of a trench. And I'm not a specialist in this, but I've helped pull ropes and stuff like that. You get a team of people who know what they're doing. I'm just there with extra hands. They know what they're doing because they move these blocks. They do it.
I have the exact same thought all the time because I wonder, how did we ever find each other as children sometimes? Because we didn't have cell phones all the time. So like, how would you say like, I'll see you someplace at 6 and everybody somehow would like depart their houses and they would find each other even though you couldn't call people. But I remember you'd like call people's homes like, hey, do you know like where Frank is? Like, oh, he's supposed to be at that. And then you'd like bike to people's houses. And,
triangulate.
Yeah. But, and then on a more serious note, have you ever seen there's a YouTube channel of a guy, I'm sure he does more than just YouTube, but he has like a fascination with how to move big things.
Yeah,
Wally Wallington great. And there's a few of them.
Yeah.
The guy who's like invented like some like crazy stuff of like moving big things with primitive.
Yeah, like counterweights and like
that's Wally Wallington.
Yeah, okay.
He's great.
Yeah, he does a great job.
Yeah.
Is there evidence that any of these types of, do we know how people moved big stuff a long time ago or is that just harder to...
Well, it's more that there's a lot of different ways they could have done it.
Okay.
And that's also what he's demonstrated. He's demonstrated different ways they could have done it. And so there's no way to be 100% sure it's that way or this way or that way. But we know they had a lot of different possible options. And so it's a lot easier to think they used those kind of options than to jump to, they had advanced technology. And so, because we know that people can move large stones and there's ethnographic photos from like 150 years ago of, groups of people that did not have advanced technology of them moving giant stones that are like 50, 60 tons. And so we know people can get this done, and there's a lot of different ways to do that.
I think that one of the things that I say a lot when talking about especially, large constructions, which is something that I experience or encounter in pseudoscience a lot, is a sort of lost, technology, if ever there was one, is the ability for a bunch of people to all work on the same thing. Like, at risk of sounding kind of, cliche, like the lost technology is teamwork. Like we don't work in a society anymore where it's, like 10,000 people all coming together to do one gigantic project. Like, we all work on our own things. Everyone goes to their office, and yeah, we work in an office building where you have a boss and you have colleagues and everyone's like collaborating on stuff. We absolutely still do that. But like, I was in Sacsayhuaman in Peru, and there's stones there that are absolutely massive. And I was even hearing guides like spouting pseudoscience about magnets and things like that. And like, I can see when you look at those, like, it is hard to wrap your head around how that happened, but you have to like remember that this was like a project that the community was dedicated to. Like, they found a way to do it, and the proof is the stone is right there, like they did move it. And an interesting thought that I had while I was there, and this is kind of, is a little bit more speculative, but as far as kind of like putting out options of like, okay, well, we don't know exactly how they did it, but they clearly did. So like, what are some logical options? I saw a video back like a few months before I went to Peru, and it was of like, some highway department in the middle of the US, and they were replacing a bridge overpass. So, there's a road that goes over a highway, and the way that they did it was they built the new bridge like a little ways down the highway next to it so they could still have that pass running. They didn't have to demolish it and rebuild it. And then in one night, they demolished that bridge and slid the whole new bridge apparatus over using dish soap. Like, they put dish soap on the ground and it reduced the friction enough that it's like, now we can like, and they still have machinery, obviously it wasn't a bunch of dudes putting their back into it, but they slid it across. So when I was in Peru and we were talking about some of these sites, one of the really cool building materials that they would use, this was really present at Ollantaytambo, was they had terrace farms, and they would pack between the stones with mud mixed with llama fat, which became somewhat like water resistant. So the water would sort of run off it instead of eroding the stones out. And llama fat, like, you can put your hand between the stones and it's still kind of like oily on your hands. And I'm like, I don't think that, oil alone would be enough to move one of these big stones, but I'm like, it's an example of just work smarter, not harder. Like, if you had a lot of people to move this thing, it would be easier to move it on like a greased surface or something that rolls or something like that than it would be to just push it along the ground. Like, when people think about moving these stones, they so frequently just think of like, they just like, you're telling me they just dragged it? Like, no, of course not. Like, they knew that that's as stupid as it sounds right now. Like, they probably did something that was smarter, not harder, in order to achieve this.
And there's a good example in Egypt. There's this tomb painting where they show a team of people, 30, 40 people, moving a giant statue that would weigh 10, 20 tons, right? And what they actually show in the tomb painting is people pouring water on the sand because it reduces the friction. And so it actually, they were working smart. And when they do record how they do this kind of stuff, we can see that it's on these kind of sledges and we can see them pouring the water and we get a sense of how they're actually doing this and accomplishing it. And so, in my mind, this idea that they could not do this without advanced technology, that's just insulting to these people. They were they were super smart. They knew how to do this with the technology they had. It's us that cannot imagine this kind of technology, and it's just it's a lack of imagination on our own part.
To be fair, they had a lot more free time to think about it.
They did. We got a lot of free time. We're right here chatting about it.
It's also like I feel like when I think about like what we're culturally used to and what we think about, like even like 200 years ago, if a person arrives at like a new like pioneer village or whatever, a lot of times they'd all come out to help them erect a house or erect a barn or anything like that. And doing kind of minimal standard carpentry was a like decently common skill. Whereas like nowadays, that's not a skill at all. But most people are pretty adept with computers to some degree, right? And so it's like, I think part of this is we get so like presentist in how we think about ancient peoples, and we forget that like not only was like the culture different, but also like the way that they experienced and thought about the world. That includes like how they thought about labor, how they thought about like, we can't imagine like spending a day like plowing a field. That sounds awful. Whereas for them, they're like, you get a horse to help you plow a field? That sounds awesome, right? And so I feel like it's just like also understanding like probably doing lots and lots of heavy physical labor was like a little bit more expected in that day and age as well.
Am I making this up, or I feel like I read something a while ago or saw something that had to do like the Amish can like build a house in a day.
Yeah, they're barn raising.
Oh yeah, maybe it's that. Yeah, they'll do this
crazy.
in literally
there's
a single
like
day.
time lapses of them doing it, and it's insane. It's just like, the sun comes up, they're there, the skeleton goes up, gets to noon, they all disappear for lunch, and then they come back, sides go up, roof goes on, it's done. And it's insane, and it's coordination. And I mean, there is even an excellent example where it's like, that is a large group of people who all have a shared goal, and they go there with the skills they have, and they do it. And like, erecting a barn is different than moving a 20-ton stone, but like, how different really? Like, there's different skills required. There's different, things that you're going to need to be specialized for to do it. But like, we have the proof that people can work really, really effectively as a group over just being an individual.
Yeah. Or the Orthodox Hasidic Jews in New York that were digging the tunnels. They did that all on their own.
Incredible.
Wow. Great example.
I doubt there was much machinery involved in that.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that people did? This is my chance to just ask crazy archaeology questions. Okay. Man, I can never think of a better thing to steal than anything out of a grave. Okay, being a grave robber. Okay, you're just burying all sorts of wealth. The guy in there is probably dead. It's just like, what were things that people did? I know they tried to put a lot of this stuff. Were the only valuable things that were buried inside of like big pyramids, or did people ever make random graves and hope that nobody would find them? Or that seems like it would be a huge concern.
So in Egypt, they started with pyramids. The robbing was such a problem that they moved to underground tombs where they'd be less visible and less accessible to grave robbers. And there's actually a lot of papyri and texts that talk about tomb robbing as a major problem, particularly during periods of economic downturn. And so, there's texts that talk about moving pharaohs' mummies from one tomb to another. We've found tombs with like, I don't know, a handful of different pharaohs all in the same tomb because they were protected from tomb robbing by hiding them there. And so it's kind of funny because people always say, well, we can't be sure the pyramids were not tombs because there's no mummies in them, which is A, not true. We do have pyramids with full mummies in them. B, we have a lot of pyramids that have skeletal parts or mummy parts in them, if you see what I mean, that have been disturbed. C, we have textual evidence from these ancient people talking about how these tombs were robbed. So it's like, sorry, these were tombs, and we understand the problems of tomb robbery, particularly during periods that were rough, in ancient Egypt.
Of like a group. So I think a lot about like missing stuff from archaeology, like the burning of the Library of Alexandria. I was like, every time I think about it, I get like a little bit stressed out.
That's a little pseudo-archaeology, actually.
Is it actually?
Yeah.
Okay, tell us about it.
Well, it just wasn't a big deal. It was basically already a defunct library, and
Like all the books.
Like all libraries are.
Yeah, well, no, like maybe like some modern libraries are. But yeah, it was really a big nothing burger, to be
Really?
honest.
So it was
yeah.
mostly emptied out. So we didn't actually lose much in that.
In fact, go on Wikipedia. There's like a nice big segment
You
on
just made
how
my
it's
day.
a nothing burger.
Every time I thought about it, I was like,
Yeah.
wait, we just like lost.
Yeah, don't worry, it wouldn't have been that much
everything?
farther ahead.
What we have is basically due to what monks chose to copy.
Oh.
And so what is lost is due to the fact that monks chose not to copy that. So that's actually why we're missing a lot of books. It's due to the fact that Christian monks chose what they wanted to preserve from the ancient world and what they did not. And so that's really what biases what we have, with the exception of occasional finds of papyri in Egypt or at Herculaneum and stuff like that.
Has there ever been an example of a large loss of knowledge or something like that would be akin to what people would imagine the burning of the Library of Alexandria to be?
I think it's mostly just a slow attrition in this sort of way. I can't think of any specific. There's an event where all
like
of a sudden
great burning of all the
because there were
books
so
or-
many other libraries as well. It wasn't like there was a major library at Pergamon. There's major libraries in Rome and Athens and stuff like that. So it's not like it was just everything was in the Library of Alexandria.
Only one spot.
Yeah,
the whole world.
people copied these scrolls and stuff like that and disseminated them.
I think a potential example, I don't know if it's exactly on the same vein as what we think of when we think of the burning of the Library of Alexandria, but I think the Spanish conquest of Latin America
Yes,
could
that's a
absolutely,
good example.
because that was an example where, like,
Yeah.
they showed, when the Spaniards showed up and the indigenous people, they had their own systems of, writing and language that were very different than what we know of as
Right.
writing and language. They had, different, chords that they would like weave together, different colors and things like that. And that requires a specific skill set in order to know how to read it. And the Spaniards were at a disadvantage because they didn't know how to read it. So they were relying on indigenous, guides, the heretics, to be telling the truth to them. And so we are at a disadvantage. We don't know how to process this information. There was, information recorded on like banana leaves. So they burned all of it. They killed the people who know how to read it. And now we have some of these chords left over that survived. Nobody knows how to read them. So that's something where they came, and instead of a burning in one tragic event, it was an intentional extermination of a culture and of all of the systems you need in order to preserve and maintain its history.
Okay, maybe I know how I should check it and see now how much pseudo-archaeology I know, and it's not real.
Good to check.
There's a really good video essay that I watched, and now I'm wondering if it was real, like good science or bad science. I won't say the name of the creator yet unless we verify that it's valid, and then we'll get rid of it. But they were basically talking about the Mayans. Which is kind of a misnomer, because when we think of Mayans, we think of Aztecs and Incas, but Mayans was actually a very heterogeneous group of people, at least according to the video. And then they talk about how there was one kind of conquistador who collected a fair bit of the information and destroyed some of it, but then also rewrote a bunch of histories himself. And so a lot of the histories that we have on this group of people is from this one guy and what he chose. Is that true?
Yeah, to some degree. I think it's Bernard Sahugin or something
That
like that.
sounds right,
I can't.
yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce his name because I don't study Maya stuff. But yeah, so he was a Christian missionary type, and he was involved in, I think, destroying some of this stuff, but also trying to record some of it. And of course, in that recording, there were a lot of problems where things changed, right? Mm-hmm. And so I actually talked about this a little bit when I was on Joe Rogan, and because you see changes in how things like Quetzalcoatl are depicted and how they're described. They start only after the conquest. Is Quetzalcoatl depicted with white skin, right?
Is that a type of
He's
god?
one of the gods, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And so, you see this sort of change there. And I had there's this great archaeologist, Curly Tlapoya, sorry, Curly, and he hosts the Tales of Atlantis. And so he actually talks about this a lot on his podcast, and it's really fantastic. Everybody check it out.
Okay, so it sounds like that wasn't pseudo-archaeology that I learned.
No, that sounds, I don't know about the specific details, but overall, the gist of it sounds
Shout
somewhat
out
accurate.
DJ Peach Cobbler. All right. That's the shout.
There you go.
Were there, for the native populations, were there a lot of talking trees, or was it just Pocahontas' grandma? How do you decide what is appropriate to place in a museum, or how do you feel about museums?
Ooh. I'll let you start with that one. Hey, fact check something.
Sure. Look, I mean, I think that as long as it's not something sacred to a culture, or it's not something like ancestors of a culture where they do not want that stuff on display in a museum, I think in general a museum is a good place for things to go. However, of course, you can't just take stuff out of its country of origin. I'm a full believer in repatriation. The British Museum should return those Parthenon marbles, as well as the Benin bronzes and all this kind of stuff, because they just literally ripped it off. They conquered those places. Well, in Benin, they were in Athens and just sawing it off the building. Literally, they sawed through the marbles to take them with them.
Christ, I didn't
and
know
it's
that.
just like, this stuff needs to go back to where it comes from. It needs to be displayed in the context in which you can understand it better. And so I think museums certainly perform a very valuable function. I collaborate with lots of museums, but it's a really tricky subject of how to deal with the mistakes of the past, if you see what I mean, past archaeologists. Because, yeah.
Is the resistance to repatriation basically they don't want to lose the things that bring them income and money?
No,
I
because
think it's a lot more
pride.
cultural.
to get into the British
Cultural
Museum is
and
free.
political?
You get into the British Museum free, for example, and most museums that have this, like in the States as well, it's like suggested donations. So they're not making a ton of money off of this, but it's really silly in my mind, because when museums have collaborated with countries of origin to repatriate material, usually the country of origin is happy to leave material there on a long-term loan, as long as they actually have ownership and they could get it back if they want it because it's their material. They're happy to leave material oftentimes in other countries to display their culture and advertise it, if you see what I mean, their past and their heritage. And so I actually think more museums need to collaborate with these cultures of origin, because most cultures of origin, they're really proud of their heritage.
Yeah.
It's just they want those specific really famous things. Here, maybe we could, a lot of things that happen is you have short-term loans as well, where artifacts start rotating from one museum to another, right? And that lets people all over the world get exposed to this kind of stuff, and that's how it should be. But it requires, empathy and collaboration and cooperation, not just saying, it's in our building, we're keeping it.
Yeah. We stole it first.
Yeah.
And I think that the Benin bronzes are actually an important sort of example to what we were talking about earlier. Are you guys familiar with the bronzes at all? So it's this series of plates that were from, squares, from Benin, which was, an immensely prosperous West African civilization. And when, the European English settlers, colonists went there and stole all their shit, they took these bronzes, and they're, beautiful, hammered out, but they tell like the story of the civilization. They were recorded history. And when they took them all out of order. So I think this is another example of like, you have single-handedly gone to a civilization and destroyed their memory. So you've taken them out of the country, and you have reshuffled them in a way that we don't know how they went together. So you have single-handedly wiped the mind of this place. So that is something which I think someone could probably argue whether that was intentional, malicious, but it's obviously not quite as extreme of an example as with the Spanish conquest in Latin America, where it was a very obvious attempt to squash and destroy and kill. But I mean, it's an example nonetheless of one event that single-handedly destroys a huge amount of information about a place.
Okay, wrapping the museum thing up. So, because my next question was going to be, is there a type of utilitarian argument to make where, okay, yeah, maybe there was some bad actions committed, but the interest that is fostered as a result of having all of these artifacts in a place, maybe it's worth it in this case. But it sounds like your argument, I wasn't aware of like the collaborative efforts that you could go through the country, that you could actually not only solve those utilitarian issues, but make a stronger argument for it, because maybe now those objects have the ability to mmove from place to place for other people to see it, which deals with that pretty neatly.
And also, like, you return the Parthenon marbles, you get something else from Greece, for example, you know? And there's this, people want to share their heritage on average. There's obviously some groups that really do not, because they were, totally exploited.
Yes.
Yes. But most groups, cultural groups or nation states, they want to share their heritage. It's just a matter of doing so in a respectful, collaborative manner.
Is there any like logistic limits that would come with that collaborative, like moving things around? Like I'm imagining all these old preserved things have to be moved, managed, and held and very, very specific ways. Is there any like concern that like different museums or the travel between or even different countries won't be able to maintain kind of the preservation standards needed for these items?
Well, that's one of the big issues with the British Museum right now. Like, it's not as climate controlled as it should be. And so, they used to say to Greece, you guys don't have a good place to store this stuff.
Yeah.
The Greeks built a whole new museum, the Acropolis Museum, which you can go to. I highly recommend it. It was literally a monument designed to house these things in state-of-the-art conditions. And so, far better conditions than in the British Museum. So yes, that is an issue. And obviously, you do not want to give your heritage to even lend it to them if they're not going to properly care for it. And so, yeah, that's certainly something important. You have trained conservators that sort of, package it up carefully and make sure that it's displayed in a climate-controlled environment and make sure that it's not going to be damaged either in movement or display or whatnot. And so, but that's actually really common. Museum exhibits travel around. It's really not an uncommon thing today. And that's also how you get to create and curate new kinds of displays for the public, which is really important because, to be honest, in the British Museum, in the Penn Museum, in any sort of museum you can think of, only about 1% of their actual artifacts are on display at any given time. There's so much in storage that you basically need to be a scholar or a student to go behind the scenes and actually see and study and things like that. And so, but this also leads to problems to study the stuff. So many people are interested in this material and it's distributed around the world. So, I write about this in the book I'm writing on Atlantis, where if you want to study, the Parthenon in a proper way, you need to be able to go travel all over the world to different museums where different things are stored, and that's just so inaccessible.
Yeah.
Who was it? I felt like I read about this after the first Dune movie came out. Was it somebody was it Egyptians? People who lived in a desert environment where you wouldn't imagine them to be able to do this were able to cool things in these like really deep things that they would build. And I think they made ice. Am I making this up? You have any idea what I'm talking about?
I don't know about ice, but there are different ways where they use drafts and shade to cool things somewhat, but I'm not sure about ice.
I think it was ice. I think you just don't know about it. No, never.
I don't know. Archaeology is huge.
I wish I remember how they would.
I guess you're just peddling pseudo-archaeology and you're letting him get away with it.
They'll edit that out. Okay, you were going to say something, I think?
Yeah, I think that like on paper, I like the idea of, a world museum in the context of, playing a game of Civilization or something like that. But like, I really don't know if there's a way to ethically do that in practice, simply because the world museum that we have when we think of as like the British Museum and many other museums are founded on artifacts that were stolen at a time when they were, taken as colonial spoils. So like these weren't things that were taken as sort of like, hey, this is really cool and we want to make a world museum. Can we like do a trade here and something like that? And it was like an agreement. It was like, wow, so you guys have some nice stuff over there. We're going to just yoink that off, saw the stuff off the Parthenon and, we're going to just call it a day. So, but the thing that I want to, kind of extrapolate on that Flint was saying is in the ability that we have now to create amazing exhibits. Like when, the Elgin marbles were first stolen and things like that, it was, you could really only have one copy of them. But now we have amazing ways to make replications of these things. And that's where I think that we could really hopefully be able to find some middle ground in the future. I watched a video recently that, I don't know the development of it at this point, but it was this Greek man who's working on like really high resolution like photogrammetry scanning for the specific intent of being able to get like really high res images of artifacts, with the ultimate goal of having the Elgin marbles repatriated and having the technology to be able to make like exact replicas of them to go to the British Museum. So granted, I don't think the Greeks should have to go through all these hurdles to get their own stuff back, but I think that it's like it opens a really interesting conversation where it's like, if you could get an exact replica of the Elgin marbles that to the layman will look exactly the same when they're up there, can we have the originals back? We'll make you these ones. You can put them in your museum. And then when people go there, they can still have the World Museum. Like the Benin bronzes can be back in Benin and, we can make replicas of them. They have so much money and like prestige. You have all the best artists in the world. We have all this technology that you can make amazing replications, make replicas, make the World Museum, and give the originals back to the people who they belong to,
Can I jump in?
Please.
We don't need that technology. I'm not saying the technology in photogrammetry and 3D printing is not great, but 50, 100 years ago, they've already made accurate casts. There's casts of the Parthenon marbles in the Acropolis Museum in Athens, and perfectly accurate casts, right? So accurate that they have the little pieces that fell off that Elgin did not take, and they have the bigger piece in the British Museum. They take the cast of the bigger piece and they slot in the little piece that's still in Athens.
That's amazing.
And so
crazy.
these kind of replicas are really common. You want to go see one of the greatest painted caves of all time. As a little kid, I got to go in the original Lascaux, but you can't anymore. It's all a replica. But I've been in the replica, and it is exactly.
What's the Lascaux?
Lascaux is one of the greatest painted caves. It's just beautiful images from the Stone Age, from like 20, 30,000 years
Is
ago.
it that sea cave that's like lifted
No,
up?
that's Kosker Cave.
Oh, okay.
If you've seen like cavepainting.png,
It's got like
probably
a
from
red
Lascaux.
horse.
Yeah.
That's like,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
And so you know, but going into the replica cave, they're actually on Lascaux 3 now. And so they can't have so many people go in because the humidity you bring in from breathing, it's really damaging to the
Wow.
paintings. And so, but the replica, it's not just a replica of the paintings, it's a replica of the geology of the cave.
Wow.
So you're still going into a fully authentic experience. It's just that people know that it's a replica, so they're like, meh. But it's like, no, you get the full experience of going into this cave and seeing exactly what it was like.
So you're kind of saying that it's not a matter of whether or not we can make replicas good enough. It's a matter of, you know, the people who actually have the originals being like, well, it wouldn't be the same, so we want to keep the
It's
real
this
ones.
mental block we have.
Yeah.
When, to be honest, look, a lot of what we study are digital things anyway. A lot of what,
Yeah,
as
yeah.
a scholar, you do hands-on work, but you also do work on replicas in a sense, oftentimes digital captures of stuff.
I would say, though, that argument can kind of go both ways, because if you would have flipped that and go, okay, well, what if we just make perfect replicas and we send it back to the people? They're like,
Yeah.
I don't want the replica, I want the real thing. It's
want
like,
the
okay,
real
well, that's why
thing.
we want to look at it.
Well, and that's what they have. That's actually what they have, is the replica.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
You make
know,
the replica, you take the originals, you put them in boxes, you shuffle them around.
And then you let them pick.
So I'm in some real existential territory there.
Pick
What's the
a
difference?
hand.
You'd be able to figure it out.
Okay, so-
some isotope analysis.
Okay, lots of more questions around like preserving old things. Okay, so say you have you make a big discovery, okay, and there's all this like crazy cool cultural stuff from, you know, culture Zeta is discovered, and you unearth like a home, and there's like maybe a burial place inside, and like a whole living room and all these artifacts, okay, and then there's one guy who's 80 years old and he's alive, and he's like, I don't want any of that to ever be messed with. And you're like, okay, well, he's alive, and I guess I'm assuming you would say, well, we should respect that culture, and that guy's alive, and then he dies next year. Is it like fair game now? And it's like, or if you would have discovered it and the guy would have been dead, can you like unearth all of it? Like, how do you decide? Earlier you said that for things that people want to remain sacred, right? Like we should like respect those and not unearth those and not display those. But do we create like a weird dichotomy where it's like, we just discovered some shit, God, I hope all the people who are associated with this are dead so that we can put it in a museum? Or is it like, there's like one guy that's still alive and now he's blocking? Like, how do you sort this out?
I don't think it's a or anything. I think like as archaeologists, we have to collaborate with these people.
Sure.
That's like what we do. When it's funny because we have this big debate here in the U.S. Where we have this, NAGPRA and other laws about how to deal with indigenous culture. And it's about respecting the wishes of these living cultures, right? And their heritage. And that's really important. But like what we don't realize, we have all these big arguments about it. It's like, should we do this? Why are we letting indigenous people decide our science? And it's like, you, man, when I'm in Greece, I have to follow the laws in Greece.
Yeah.
I can't just go do whatever I want. I have to apply for a permit. I need to demonstrate why I'm doing it. They need to give me permission. I cannot do that without their permission. And so when I go to a different country, I need to do that. So when we're here, why should we not have the same kind of things for people that are alive? And, there's so many examples of people in, the last 100 years ago, 50 years ago, whatever, of literally stealing their religious statues from East Asia. And now they're in like the Met Museum and bullshit like that. And it's like, that's literally what people did. They went to an active temple where people were worshiping and they ripped the statue out of there and brought it to a museum. And it's just like, that would be like going into your church and ripping out the crucifixion and bringing it into a museum. Is that something that you think people should be allowed to do? I mean,
So here's another question. These are really tough, also ethical questions too.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there are super right answers on all of these. It feels like when you go back to a certain point of time, for certain types of cultures, oh man, I'm about to say this is going to be normatively loaded, so bad and so white and so Western. So forgive me for any archaeological.
We have to be able to
it's
ask the
important to
questions.
learn,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
So, I feel like an alt-writer right now. For the Western cultures that survived or thrived or engaged in like imperialism, colonialism, captured artifacts, killed people, enslaved peoples, these types of societies that are alive today, that are the dominant cultures, seem to have to take, it seems like we can we can make normative judgments about behaviors they had engaged in. And we could go, this was bad, that should go back, you should feel bad about this. And these are like crimes that these countries have committed, Great Britain, the United States even, that like we should reckon with. However,
one thing, we're not asking people to feel bad.
Sure.
We're just trying to make sure that we respect in today.
Yeah, acknowledge that like a moral crime or moral wrong has been committed. That like So if I were to go into, let's say that I were to discover like an old Aztec temple, okay, and I were to find like a statue or something, and I was like, this is cool, I want to take this and I want to display this somewhere, okay, and somebody catches me, okay, the archaeology police show up and they go, you can't take that from that culture, that's not fair, okay, and then I were to say, okay, well, why is it that and I'm going to go full Vosh here and use the Nazi example. Why is it that it's okay to steal or take something from like the Nazi civilization and display their stuff when that empire was destroyed? But the Aztecs, who I know because I watched a documentary called Apocalyptico, okay? I know that the Aztecs were involved in a lot of exploitation of other cultures. Why do I have to respect their statues and their monuments? And I can't take anything out of that. But for other people, like say, like, fascist states that existed around World War II, we can take that and display that. Like, how do you sort through what's okay, what's not okay?
I don't think it's okay to display Nazi shit.
Sure.
To be honest.
Hold on. Let me
for a
clarify.
different reason.
I'm not saying, I don't mean like flying a swastika flag out here, but I mean like I'm sure there are museums, World War II museums, where you can see
But some of that, of course, is the German government and people are okay with that. If you see what I mean, because they understand the importance of showing the errors that they committed. In Germany, they're very staunch on that, of acknowledging the harm that was committed and trying to teach people from doing that kind of harm again in the future. And so, that's in a sense with the permission of that culture of origin. Okay. And so there's nothing wrong. That's why I said there's nothing wrong with displaying stuff in museums as long as you have that kind of permission in a collaborative fashion, right?
I guess I feel like people would feel more normatively okay though with the idea of like, say there was a family like that's alive right now in Germany that had lots of Nazi ties and they had like some really interesting artifacts from World War II and stuff like that. And they're like, no. I don't want these things presented. I don't in general. I understand I think academics would just respect that fundamentally. But I think normatively a lot of people would be like, it would be probably okay to just like take it anyways and put it up because like they're Nazis and they're defending Nazis now. Whereas if it's a family that's connected to just like a more like neutral like religious group or something like that, even if the religious group is mostly conquered and gone, if it's like their descendants and like no, most people would normatively be like, no, you can't take that. That's like bad. And so I guess like there is that like interesting like dichotomy that exists that I'm curious if the field just kind of goes carte blanche. They have a strong principle and it doesn't really matter how we normatively feel about that culture, or do you get what I'm asking? Sort of.
I mean, I don't think there's a big difference, if you see what I mean. I don't think in the field it matters that like the Romans were evil because the Romans were evil people. They enslaved a lot of people. It's not about a value judgment of this culture. It's about understanding the laws and respect for the survivors today. If something's found in Italy, Italy has the right to decide what to do with it, right? If something's found in Navajo Nation traditional land, Navajo Nation should have the right to be able to determine what to do with it. And so that's really what it's about. If it's tough to talk about Nazi artifacts. I don't really get that. But whatever. If you want to talk about someone's family heirlooms, well, then they're probably owned by that family, so it's their property. So even today, we'd need the permission of the person who owns their heirlooms to display it because they own it. Right? And so that's the key is you can't just strip things from people and just take it.
I think that, I don't know, I agree with all of that. I think that all makes a lot of sense. And there's kind of like no right answer to this, and I'm sure everyone will kind of have a different take. But one of the things I'm kind of thinking about is like, I don't know if it's as good of a parallel as I think we're kind of treating it, where I don't know if I would like say that there is a concrete correlation between like a Nazi artifact and the idol you found in the Aztec temple, because like I don't know, and maybe, you guys can check me on this if this isn't right, but like the Nazis weren't like a civilization. Like it was like a, it was an ideological group that arose. It was a, military thing. And yeah, they do have like, there is the Nazi era of Germany where they have like, there are artifacts from that time. And I do get that. But like, the Aztec culture was something that regardless of how many people they subjugated and, how much, destruction they wrought, like it was something that like lasted for a very long time, was part of like an ebb and flow of culture. And I guess you could argue that the Nazis were the same way, but like, I find find a hard time seeing an exact parallel in that, because they were something that had a lot more of a I don't know, there was a longer time and it was more of a cultural development and based in a little bit more than sort of like a modern, political ideology.
I guess the question would be like, say nuclear war happens, climate change happens, and then new humans are spreading over the planet 1,000 years from now, and they uncover the lost society of Great Britain.
Yeah.
And then they find the British Museum, and then people are like, wait, we need to take these and take them back. Like, hold on. That was British society, okay? That was their culture. Now, their culture was one of theft and things from other cultures. But that was part of their society.
And it is kind of funny that you honestly bring up an interesting point. I remember learning about this in one of my archaeology classes in college, that people have been kind of doing this literally forever is the other thing. I think the term for it is spolia in like archaeological sites where they'll find, buildings that are constructed with materials from other older buildings. Yep. So, and like, that's hilarious. Like people have been doing that literally forever. Like,
the Romans did to the Greeks, right?
The Romans did it to the Greeks, and then the next people did it with the Roman stuff, and So.
We sort of think of it as the life cycle of an archaeological artifact. So, in the news lately, there's been all this talk of like tearing down statues, right? But that's actually part of that statue's life cycle, if you will. In museums in Greece and whatever, we have statues that the Christians tore down. They knocked off their noses, they tagged them with crosses, and they're in museums, and that's part of that statue's history,
that's
if you
crazy.
see what I mean. Yeah. And so like us tearing down statues actually adds, value in a sense, historical value to that statue. And so because it has that story behind it and it tells us about our culture today.
Not that you would encourage anybody to go and vandalize any statues or anything.
Flint Dibble supports the destruction of statues.
I think it depends on the statue and the situation. I don't see a reason to preserve everything. That's not what we do. If we want to preserve everything, then we need to stop living.
Sure.
Because you can't preserve everything. And so we need to be conscious about selecting what we preserve and for why, because we don't have the funds and abilities to preserve everything.
But it creates that moral issue of essentially what gets desecrated is essentially what the present culture decides is probably evil and bad, right?
Always.
Which is like this interesting
That's
moral
part of
question of
history.
being like, okay, well, if we feel like this thing is evil and bad right now, obviously the people at the time definitely would have disagreed, and they would have felt exceptionally disrespected by doing those things. So it's like, how do we like draw these fine lines other than like, it's vibes, man, whatever feels good for us in present culture, being like repatriation sounds really good to our culture because our culture values that right now. But 200 years from now, they might be like, that's cringe. Like, who cares?
Repatriation is cringe.
I don't know. I think that is the key, though. We're making decisions for now and thinking about the future as we make those decisions. Archaeologists, we have a very deep time perspective. It's one of the advantages of archaeology. And that deep time perspective, I told you guys about that wall I excavated yesterday that ended up being a modern wall that was constructed by, the conservators at Pompeii did such a good job of making it look like the original, right? And so now we know when we reconstruct an ancient wall, there's like a 10-to-1 rule. From 10 feet away, it should look authentic. From 1 foot away, you should be able to recognize that it's a modern reconstruction, right? Because we have that long-term perspective. We don't want future archaeologists to be confused. And so, same thing why we don't excavate a whole site, because we understand that that's going to need to be sampled later with different methods and different questions. And so, it's the same thing with what we choose to preserve and how we do it. These are important discussions to have and to think through what are our values now and how can we make sure that this stuff is available in the future, or at least a sample of it is.
How do you weigh, and again, I understand this is maybe this isn't completely in the purview of archaeology, but in Canada, I think there was a tribe called, I think it's like the Wet'suwet'en or something. But one of the disagreements that they had when it came to constructing pipelines in the Northwest was they would have, I think they would call like a band camp or a band council. But basically you would have a group of like democratically elected leaders that represent the tribe. And they were in favor of a lot of the construction of these pipelines because it represented a lot of economic activity and jobs and everything. But then you had like the traditional like patriotage, like tribal leaders who were opposed to it, and you had this huge conflict between the two. And obviously Western person like me and other people in Canada were saying, okay, well, the democratically elected leaders want to move ahead with this project and that should happen, and they're democratically elected. But people that were more I can say respectful or cognizant of the older culture would say, okay, well, these like democratically elected people are part of like a Western imposition essentially that we would have never had you guys not come to this land. And the older people that were like more traditionally chosen say that they don't want to ever build on these lands. Do you ever come into conflict where, as an archaeologist, you guys are trying to decide how to how to proceed on some land, and maybe the government of Egypt or maybe the government of some country says, yeah, we think this is fine, but there might be like a local representative group, somebody that might even have like a stronger personal historical tie to the land, like, you shouldn't do that. How do you decide? I know.
Multiple claims of ownership.
It's going to always be a case-by-case basis. And this is actually a really tricky question, especially with, rules like NAGPRA, where actually multiple tribes might actually have a claim on artifacts, burials, ancestors, etc. And so because that creates issues that are not easy to navigate. And like you said, in other countries as well, same sort of thing. You excavate on land that has a very significant archaeological site. Well, that landowner doesn't want to sell their land, but they have to sell the land to the government because the government expropriates it. And so, they're going to then plant olive trees on it to make it more valuable or something like that, because then they just set a price. And so, these are conflicts. The archaeology is not some sort of neutral situation. It's about figuring out and negotiating these tricky ethical dilemmas.
Yeah, case by case is really, the only way that it can kind of operate. And again, Flint has, a much more extensive experience with this than I do, but in the one of the examples that comes to mind for me is when I went to Karahan Tepe, I was walked around by a man whose family had lived on that land, like literally forever. He was this Kurdish guy. His family has been there since, as long as they can remember. And he was thrilled about it. Like, he's like, yeah, I always knew there was something on this hill. You can see the tops of the stones sticking out. Like, we let our sheep graze here. I remember playing on the rocks as a kid. And like, now it's being excavated. And like, he was thrilled about that because like, there's people coming to this area. I mean, you're like, 20 miles from the border with Syria. Like, this is a part of the world that like, does not see a lot of tourism, And he's like, this is great. Like, there's like people here who are interested in this. There's like activity happening on this site. I finally get to see what's under the ground there. So that case was a great example of someone who like, this is their ancestral land. This is their traditional land. And they are thrilled about what's happening there. So again, case by case basis where there could be an example. And I don't know what would happen if he was, very against excavation. But in this case, he was absolutely thrilled about it.
I was going to say, politically, that sounds kind of scary if I didn't realize. So that's very far southeast in Turkey. Yes. That implicates a lot of Kurdish people.
Oh, yeah.
Who are not fans of the Turkish people there.
That was
really spooky.
That was a very challenging thing to navigate while I was there because I was, kind of vaguely familiar with the politics of that situation, but going there, you get very familiarized with it very quick. And we were there within 4 or 5 months, I think, of the earthquake that was like centered on like Adiyaman. So like the Kurdish part of Turkey was like decimated by a huge earthquake, and like response was really slow. I'm not going to get into all the politics stuff now, but it was really interesting, and politics is a huge part of it. We talked about this yesterday, that like, I don't want politics to be part of archaeology, but it will always have some politics because there will be leverage for one reason or another by one group or one people, and that's just the way it is.
And that's an important part of it. This is why archaeologists spend a lot of time in a country. I've lived in Greece for like 7-8 years, and you get to know the people, you get to know the politics even, because if you want to do research there, you need to be able to navigate that effectively, and you need to understand the impact your research has on that local situation, right? And so, there's a big problem these days with the rise in archaeological science where people will just fly into all these different places and take materials. And that's a big ethical conundrum, if you see what I mean. We want to not go back to that era. Yeah. We want to actually be engaged with the modern cultures and people that live there.
There's a lot of people that still think that the pyramids were built basicve 99% by slave labor.
Aliens.
Slave aliens.
It was actually aliens.
Is that true? Is that not true? I've never dug into these by deep. I've heard that it was actually a lot of like workers, contractors, and everything.
I think so. Yeah. So they've actually excavated one of the workers' villages.
It's
in Giza and stuff like that, and they have a lot of evidence for their diet and what they're doing and stuff like that. And so, when
they were paid, they were like craftsmen. Like I hear that a lot, and it's something I've had to debunk a lot because I've also peddled that as well. Like, I feel like it's kind of just the thing people think of with pyramids, where like, it's not even like pseudoscience misinformation that's being like peddled to you. It's sort of just like what the general understanding of it is. Like, when you think about the building of the pyramids, it's like, oh, they did it with slave labor. Like, it's kind of like...
It's like the Prince of Egypt.
Yes. It's like an urban myth that just sort of has like perpetuated. So like, I've totally fallen into that. But in the research that I've done, which granted is probably not as deep as someone who's like really studied Egypt, I don't think there is extensive evidence for it being a large part of the workforce.
I recommend everybody check out the Fake History Hunter on Twitter, and she just wrote a nice book. And I've learned that I sometimes peddle fake history because there's these myths that just get repeated over and over again. And so, she does a really good job of sort of debunking these things that are just so popular today that's just wrong. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm super curious about, I remember learning a bunch about this is, and I'm 99% confident this is not true. Batteries, specifically this idea that batteries were invented. I've heard like Egyptians had it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, that seems ridiculous.
You came to the right guy.
Okay.
Yeah, I did a whole video on the Baghdad battery. I did 2 videos on the Baghdad battery because great example of I didn't have all of the information that is available on the Baghdad battery. So to surmise that, I don't know if this is the exact one that you're thinking of, but it's probably the most commonly cited, is this artifact that was a clay jar that had a bitumen, like kind of tar cap on it, and some metal sticking through, and evidence of like a residue of some kind of acid. And so that's what you need to make a battery, generate a small electric current. And so that was used and extrapolated upon as evidence of like ancient people used electricity, which like, whether or not it produced electricity, ancient people did not use electricity. Like we would have evidence of wires, and no, it wasn't, Nikola Tesla, and he was like beaming, energy between batteries to the top of the pyramid. Like it wasn't shit like that. Like we would have more evidence if they did use it. But that was actually a really interesting one to look at because what ended up, what I kind of ended up coming to is I made my whole first video on it of like, there isn't very much evidence that it was a battery. And Dr. Brad Hafford of the Penn Museum, who is a Near East archaeologist, has worked, around this site and has access to a lot more resources than I did a whole response video of it, kind of adding to what I had already said, correcting some of the things that I got wrong. And it was great. And I did my, a video back with him. And the conclusion we kind of came to is like, there is a chance that it was used to generate an electric current. And like, there's a chance. It's not like huge. We don't exactly know. And if it was used to generate an electric current, it was more of like a novelty kind of thing. It would either have been used to like electroplate things. Like if it generated a small current, you could put that into a bath with, dissolved metals and it could like plate stuff. Or like, for ceremony where you put it into like a, a statue, it'll conduct a little metal. And when you touch it, it goes, ooh. But like, it was probably more that than like, people that, like I said, extrapolate. So they'll see that here, there's a chance it generated electrical current, and ancient people used electricity, which like absolutely not. Like the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, but probably a little closer down here. We're like, if it was, that's great. And technically, I guess ancient people did generate electricity, but it wasn't for like widespread electrical use.
Yeah.
Gotcha. I wish that people would, something that you mentioned, and you guys have done this a couple times now. One thing that when people think of, they'll find a little fact, and then they'll start to fill in like, oh my God, like when I went there yesterday and I saw like a little speck of red paint. I bet this whole room used to be red or something. Yeah. And you just did it now where you said, if there would have been a battery, we would have seen wires, we would have seen other things. You said, there's a global civilization of Atlantis. Where the fuck are their ships?
Yeah.
How do they move things, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes I wish people, instead of finding like 1 or 2 things that are maybe difficult to explain, because again, right, I think we've, in both of our talks, said this, like some things are peculiar, some things are weird, sometimes reality is stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
I wish that people would ask more questions like, okay, well, if this was the case, wouldn't we expect to see like all of this other stuff too? Like is it really the fact that somebody invented one battery that was useful for electricity and just like one guy, the Egyptian Tesla guy just stayed in his house all day and did nothing with it?
Yeah.
Or like, I wish people would, there'd be other stuff to support the existence of this particular thing.
There's no nuance to it. It's like, if A, then just take it as far as you possibly can.
Sure. Yeah.
I feel like it's the most important question actually that you posed to Graham Hancock. You're talking specifically about that little mile long like coastal region where you have tons of evidence of hunter tribes. And it's like, if there was an ice age civilized, like developed civilization, and Graham's like, I didn't say that we wouldn't find hunter-gatherer. And it's like, if we can find that, why wouldn't we find this developed civilization, which would have more monuments, more technology, more things that would last?
How are these losers running around with stone-tipped arrows? We're finding all this stuff of them, but the massive civilization, these guys couldn't make anything that could like stand the test of time.
And what they do is they sell this idea, I mean, pseudoscientists, they sell this idea that, we're just going to discover something new soon. And we always discover something new. I'm not denying that. That's why we continue doing archaeology, is to add to our understanding of the past. But we never discover something that's like, holy shit, now everything about human history has changed. And it's like, people say that about Göbekli Tepe, and it's like, that did not do that. We already had monumental architecture from that period at Jericho and Tel el-Sultan. We already had a T-Pillar site at Neveli Chori. But nobody thinks about this stuff. They instead get this narrative that just sort of ignores that, where it says, who knows what archaeologists might find next? That gives you the right to imagine anything.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, that does not give you the right to imagine anything. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of knowledge that we do have. One of my phrases that I always use is archaeologists always work from the known to the unknown. So this takes place when you excavate. When you excavate and you come down on a new layer of sediment, right? So a new sort of period of time is in that layer of sediment. What you do is you've started exposing it over here in the trench and you continue exposing it across the trench. You don't just jump over to the other side of the trench and start digging willy-nilly. You work from the known to the unknown. Same thing if you find a block of a wall. Same thing if you're trying to put together a culture. You take what you know and then you move on from that to build hypotheses about what you don't know. You don't just start with the unknown.
Yeah, it's like when you're talking about like when somebody says they don't understand how a thing works. When an expert says it, there's a different context there.
Yeah.
Like it's bounded, like very heavily bounded.
Well said. That's
like
a good
you walk
word.
into somebody's house and they're like, "Oh, do you know where like Sam the cat is?" And you're like, "Oh, I'm not sure where they are right now." Oh, so they could be in
Mars, dude.
Yeah, they could be on Mars, or they could
they
be
never existed?
in Britain, or they could be no, mother. They're probably in the house somewhere. What do you
Yeah,
mean?
exactly.
Probably in the
Exactly.
house, like in the walls. Like, well, no, probably on the floor somewhere.
Yeah, maybe in his
okay,
bed.
so
I
do
don't
you know
know.
where they are? It's like, okay, well, I'm just Jesus. Yeah.
You know what's
when
really funny? Have you ever noticed when you can't find your keys? Right?
We used this analogy yesterday.
Oh, yeah, that's what I forgot.
and they're always, oh, damn.
Yeah, I know. And I was thinking about it, and then he used it, and I was like, "Damn it, I was thinking of that." And now
That's
you were
in my
trying.
Twitter thread on the
Jesus
landing.
Christ! It is. It's in the last place you look. And we talked about this. I don't know if you guys covered this in your discussion, but like we talked a little bit about the idea of like the paradigm shift, which is something that a lot of the alt history pseudo archaeology crowd cling to a lot, which is this idea that like they're going to make the discovery that changes everything, and like. That just doesn't happen. Like, it'll change stuff within a field. Like, you know, I mentioned Graham Hancock's shirt of like, things just keep getting older. It's like, no shit. No one is arguing with
That's
that.
just
when
headlines,
people-
though. That's just because
Yeah.
headlines focus on the oldest shit.
Yeah,
And it's like,
exactly. Yeah.
things
It's starting
get-
to say paradigm shift. They just mean like, oh, we got a new way to look at a thing, but we're not throwing everything else out.
Exactly.
That
No,
never happens.
exactly.
Like,
Yeah, it doesn't flip the table.
And on that, I want to be very clear. Things do not always get older. Sometimes things get younger. So like the domestication of the chicken, we now know happens like thousands of years later than we
Really?
used to think.
Oh, I'm glad.
You know,
I-
all kinds of
that's
stuff
good.
gets younger. All sorts of dating in the Mediterranean due to the eruption of Santorini and the burial of Akrotiri, that's now dated a couple hundred years later. The start of red figure pottery is now dated like 50 years later. There's all kinds of things that get younger too. It just doesn't make the headlines.
It's like that little
You
plus
know?
minus bar error bars when you have some, piece of data where it's like, it's here, but like there's always a little room to kind of swing it. Like things will, like you said, like I think I even, kind of fell into that trap yesterday when I was talking about Göbekli Tepe, being like, yeah, it did push back how, long things have been around. But like you said, like we had sites that dated to that point already.
Oh, yeah.
And like, yeah, that may have like changed it or altered it. And that doesn't change how, there could still be sites discovered around there that are going to be older than that. But like, it's not something that's suddenly like, wow, they found Göbekli Tepe. Everything we know about archaeology, the whole field is suddenly just like, that was all wrong. Like, no, that is not how that works. That just developed our understanding of that region, that civilization, that culture, the crops around there, the way that people interacted with each other. It just refined it further, you know?
Yeah.
I brought this up when I talked with him yesterday. Have you heard of Isaac Asimov's little short story or little essay about how flat earthers aren't wrong?
Well, actually, that's something I like to bring up sometimes too. I've never read the essay, but like on a local basis, of course, the Earth is flat. We work
Yeah,
that way.
it's a good
When I
observation.
map out an archaeological site, I work on a grid that's flat.
Oh, okay.
You know what
Yeah.
I mean? And so it's only when I fly between the UK and here where they need to calculate the curvature of the Earth because it's on such a large scale, right? And so, but on a local scale, of course, the Earth is flat.
Okay, yeah. That's essentially what the essay is about.
Yeah.
That, like flat Earth is it's an intelligent extrapolation of the planet because it's more intelligent than thinking it's random.
Yeah.
But like the curvature of the Earth is so slight that they're very close. And I feel like that applies to a lot of things, even paradigm shifting things. Like the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe. You're already really far ahead of people that don't think that space exists. You're really far ahead of people that think that we live in a dome, right? And the math is really complicated to make it work. But the guy that thought that the Earth was the center of the universe is more correct than the guy that thinks that there is no space at all, but less correct than, was it Galileo? Who's the one that figured out that the sun was the...
Yeah, I think it's Galileo.
Okay,
yeah.
sure. Okay, yeah, you guys should know that. Yeah. But yeah, he's obviously more correct
I'm
than
not
that.
an
Yeah.
astronomer, dude, but no, and I think that's really important because also I want to be clear, archaeologists and historians are constantly rewriting history as well. That's like what we do, right? We change the narrative, but it's like it's like a local contextual narrative. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe did change history of that local region and culture. My study of animal bones from this site right here, Nicoria, changed everybody's picture of what the Greeks were eating at that time. They weren't feasting on meat. They were actually impoverished and eating very little meat. And so, that changes that picture, but it's, that's super interesting to archaeologists, but it's not like, holy shit, we now understand that human history has changed in a big way. It's like, no, screw that.
And that's the thing that I think is really interesting and is kind of, the telltale signs of pseudo-archaeology is that they talk about like archaeology as a whole. Like archaeology is the study of just like the entire planet of people, like, as one group, which like it isn't. I used the example yesterday talking about, the pollen, samples from lakes. Like if some big discovery was made there, it's like, well, it turns out spruce trees entered, Maine about 70 years before we previously thought. This changes that. Like, okay, that doesn't change, everything about it. Or like, we found an arrowhead at this site, that was dated, to another 200 years before the other one was. And it's like, okay, that changes that. Like, they are speaking in absolutes about the way that human history has worked on a global scale, which it just didn't. It was regional.
One of the things, it might have been in our talk or it might have been our talk, is that we talked about how to protect against like misinformation. And one of the things that I bring up is that for some fields, just it sucks, but there's no shortcut to reading and developing like the vocabulary of the field. And once you have like some kind of working vocabulary, it becomes very quick and easy to pick out like who's full of shit. Sometimes because people will make a claim and they don't realize like how insane the claim they're making is.
Oh yeah.
For anything related to physics, anytime somebody talks about a particular thing, it's like, oh, they found this thing and it's faster than light. Like anytime you hear somebody say that, if you have any familiarity with physics, like this is a claim that if it was made, this is groundbreaking. This would be the largest. Every single person on the planet will be talking about this. This wouldn't just be a random thing. I used to bring this up all the time, and I've been vindicated that there is no such thing as a drug that will help you lose weight that's being marketed somewhere, because it is impossible, it is inconceivable that a weight loss drug would exist like that, because if it did, every motherfucker on the planet would be talking about it and taking it. And now it's happened with
Ozempic.
What? Well, now it's happened with Ozempic. And now that Ozempic is out, everybody's taking it. And it's the same thing with like penis enlargement pills, right? That like if a dick enlargement pill existed, it's not a secret. Every single person on the planet would know about this thing existing. Sometimes people make these claims and it's like, I don't think you realize what you're saying. Like, oh, we found this guy and he had a farm 100,000 years ago. It's crazy. It's like, that's do you understand that like the claim you're making, that's a really
huge.
A huge claim. Yeah.
The reason why it's successful is what Steph Halmhofer, she's at the University of Alberta, and she talks about pseudo-archaeology and stuff like that. It's called stigmatized knowledge. And the idea is these kind of claims are basically saying they're keeping it secret from you or something like that. There's some reason why people aren't talking about it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's forgotten
Big
knowledge. There's different kinds of it as
you.
well. And so that's the kind of rhetoric that they pull. And it sounds logical because you're hearing this and you're like, oh yeah, I don't like politicians, and so therefore archaeology is funded by politics, so therefore da-da-da-da-da. And there's like this progression of logic that sort of people get, enamored in. But yeah, you need to be able to step back and say, that really just does not make sense. It's like this new thing about olive trees being planted on Göbekli Tepe, and it's like, dude, almost every single site in the Mediterranean has olive trees planted on it. That's just how it is. We find sites in the middle of olive groves. Farmers plant olive trees. I've had to dig around olive trees. I've had to cut roots and deal with it. That's normal.
What is I haven't looked into the whole olive tree thing. Kind of came up in like the last little bit of my vacation and me coming down here, so I haven't actually I don't really know anything about it yet. What is the deal with that? Is it that like they're planting olive trees to prevent sites from being I don't know what the conspiracy is.
The conspiracy is that it started in June. And that they want to not excavate Göbekli Tepe because they want to hide our prehistory from us.
Of course,
is the argument.
And that's like the really old fancy
with
one
the
that
T-pillars and like
Where's that again?
Huh?
Is this in Turkey?
This is in Turkey.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the idea is that they planted the olive trees on it, and they're not excavating it. In fact, they talk about how it's only 5% excavated, and there's no plans to excavate the whole site in our lifetime. And parts of it have been reburied, and they're doing all this to hide stuff from us. And it's just like,
not just to let technology
wait
get
a
better.
second, dudes. Those olive trees were planted by the farmer who owned the land because he knew that the land was going to be expropriated by the Turkish government, and if it's land with olive trees on it, it means more money. So, all right, that's a logical thing. And to be honest, that happens all the time with archaeology. People know they have to sell their land. They try to do something to make it classified as a different kind of land so that it's worth more. Because in a lot of countries, the government has to buy the land before you can excavate. And if you're a foreign project, you need to raise the money to buy the land, give it to the government so that you can then get permission to excavate it. This is really common all over the Mediterranean world, right? And so that's the first bit. That's why the olive trees are there.
Oh God, there's more? Jesus Christ.
They claim that it's being reburied. But look, most sites I've worked on, not every single one, most sites you excavate and you rebury after you're done excavating. It's called backfilling. And the reason why is as soon as you excavate something and expose it to the environment, it starts deteriorating. So if you don't have $1 million budget to actually conserve it and present it and manage it for indefinitely, because that's what it takes is indefinite management, then the only way to preserve what you just excavated is to rebury it. Because otherwise that site's going to be gone in 50 years. And I've gone to sites that were excavated, 100 years ago, and what you do is you try to look for the site. It's just gone. Oof. Completely disappeared because nobody bothered to backfill it or rebury it or conserve it. And so there's no conspiracy here. And by the way, they're excavating right now, right this moment at Göbekli Tepe.
What?
It's just that the excavation season had not started yet that early in the summer. They're literally excavating. On my YouTube, I interviewed the director of the project so that we could address some of these claims and actually, talk about all the new cool finds that they have. And it's just like this idea, we don't want to excavate. We want to hide this stuff. No, we're there giving away our information for free on YouTube, sharing this stuff for as far and wide as we can and explaining this stuff. And but this conspiracy is still going.
That is crazy.
I feel like, I'm not sure if it's maybe our penchant for the individual narrative, but it feels like a lot of people are very averse to the concept of standing on the shoulders of giants. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was developing my undergrad thesis or whatever, and I was that very silly young research girl who was I'm gonna make this crazy research study, and my prof was actually do a lit review, see what's interesting, and change 2 factors. And then go from there, right? Which is what I did. And then I got an excellent thesis out of it, right? That led to a whole bunch of other really, really cool opportunities. But the issue is it feels like people are so often they want to be the anime protagonist character that digs deep and everything is just about them and they change the whole world. Whereas
single-handedly,
that just doesn't really happen. There are these great figures in history that do kind of change the world. A lot of times they're mythologized. Even modern historical figures get mythologized to some degree. But also even those characters and individuals, they're still standing on the shoulders of giants. They still wouldn't Alexander the Great wouldn't have existed if he didn't have all of the other nameless people that we don't really know about supporting him, tutoring him, educating him, supporting him.
And they're all named actually. Aristotle was his tutor.
Yeah.
There you go.
We know his generals and stuff like that. We actually know that kind of stuff. And if you want to accomplish something really valuable for society, if you want to accomplish something really valuable for society, you need to work within society to do that. It's about that teamwork in a sense, right?
Exactly.
And it's about managing that team.
If that's the case, how do you explain what Tony Stark built in a cave with just a box of scraps? Just a box of scraps.
Damn.
You got me, man.
You touched on this earlier. I had a history PhD email me this a long time ago, so I'm curious what your thoughts are on history being written by the victors. What do you think about that statement?
Wow. I mean, I think in a general sense, I think I agree with it. I don't think I've really ever sat down to analyze it as it seems like we're about to right now. So I don't know. I'm going to let Flint kick this one off. I haven't really thought about it beyond
I have
that.
actually a really good example of that. So to a certain degree, archaeology is also written by the victors. Mm-hmm. Most of what we find and is visible in the archaeological record is the stuff of the elites. Their monumental tombs, their palaces. That's so much easier to find than some little tiny farmhouse, right? And so the victors are far more visible and they're far more represented in the archaeological record, in what's in museums, in what we write about. And like I said yesterday, we're actually trying to find a way to push back against that. That's why people are studying animal bones. That's why we study sediments. That's why we're trying to look at sort of ordinary people, this subaltern approach. But a really good example of how that impacts the field and leads us sometimes in a wrong direction is with the topic of Roman slavery. So in the Roman period, you know, they had a lot of slaves, right? There were a lot of enslaved people that were conquered or born into slavery and subjugated or whatever, and it was a real part of their society. But their slavery in the Roman period is a lot different from slavery in the 19th century America, right? So at the same time, a lot of enslaved people were freed. They were granted freedom by their owners if they did a good job for a long time, or maybe when it was really common when the slaveholder died, in their will they would grant freedom to a large number of their slaves, and so it's called manumission. And this is really, really visible in the archaeological record because all these manumitted slaves, they were really proud of it, and it's on their tombstone. If they erect sort of monuments to it, it would be recorded in text and stuff like that. But the people who aren't recorded are the people who are not manumitted. And so there's this perspective that really pervaded in the study of Roman history for a long time that slavery there was not as bad because a lot of people were freed. But the thing is we have such a biased picture of it because what we see is all these inscriptions and tombs and gravestones and things like that of the people that are freed. The people that were not freed, the only time we see them is, like, for example, in Pompeii, where they all died and they're still shackled up in their farmhouse, and we see that when we excavate that farmhouse outside of Pompeii because it was buried in ash. And so, you know, the poor enslaved people who remained enslaved, they're lost to history in a way that the freed people were not. And so now we're coming to grips with that and saying, wow, Roman slavery really was not that good. It fucking sucked. We now understand how abused these people were who were enslaved, if you see what I mean. And it all has to do with the way that history gets recorded and brought down to us.
Okay.
Yeah.
You took it in a slightly different way in terms of the type of history that's available, but I think in a roundabout way, maybe you agree with the emailer. He hated that perspective that history was written by the victors, and his point was history is written by historians. That at least in democracies, that it's not the case that like just a leader will say this is what happened historically. It's the establishment of historians engaged in historiography and historical practice that decide ultimately like what gets recorded and what like how the interpretations and everything are done. And that phrase of history is written by the victors, he hated it because I guess it gave the impression that well, since we won these wars, now everything that we say is forever tainted and biased, and it's incapable of ever like portraying anything in reality.
I think that's kind of just boiling it down a little bit more to the sum of its parts, though, where it's like, yeah, of course, history is written by historians, but those historians are the victors. Like, they're the historians of whoever pervaded and whoever kind of came out on top, you know?
Sure, but I think it's trying to separate out the idea that when you say history is written by the victors, the impression that's brought to mind is that the goal then is to just make your society or culture look as good as possible at the detriment of anything else that exists beforehand.
I don't know if that's always a conscious goal, but it certainly can be an unconscious one.
It can be, for sure,
And here's an example of a loser writing history is Polybius. He's the one who wrote about the wars between Rome and Carthage, right? And he was actually an enslaved Greek who was enslaved due to the fact that his city-state lost in war to Rome, but he became kind of this kiss-up historian who kissed up to the Romans and everything like that and recorded them as being glorious and great. And so, you know, it's sort of like, look, everything that's written down, even what's not written down, our material culture that we have, is all very biased. And we need to pick apart those kind of contexts and biases anyway. And so I think it's not just a cut and dry victors, losers. Sure. It's just recognizing the biases that are there and trying to understand them. Yeah.
Just on something you said, I hate the term slavery because there are so many different types. It's very annoying that it all gets lumped together as the same thing.
I agree.
I just wanted to throw that out there. What do you think right now? So obviously, even in our lifetime, it sounds like there have been major changes in archaeological practice, whether you're talking about backfilling, whether you're talking about ideas around repatriation. Do you think there's something that exists right now in archaeology that in the next like 50 years, you think we're probably going to do this a lot different, or this practice is probably like up for reconsideration or something?
I think the toolbox will just kind of get better. Like, I can't think, at least off the top of my head, of a particular thing that we will do totally differently. I'm sure Flint will probably, maybe think of something.
On the toolbox thing, you guys talk about how you might not excavate a site fully because you're waiting potentially for new technologies.
So that's kind of where I'm going with that, is like there may be just better technology in the future that will allow us to do those things. Like backfill is an example where backfill wasn't always done. It's done now. I don't see a reason why that would change. But we will have better technology in the future that maybe we will, excavate more, be able to go back to places that have been backfilled and like be able to, garner more information from it and stuff like that. If we can look at different isotopes in the soil or, I'm throwing out kind of random examples, but I think that it'll be more of sort of, narrowing down what we are able to do with the sites that we have. I don't know. Do you think there'll be like a change in like practice as a whole though? Repatriation.
I mean,
too. I bet there'll be more.
There's going to be more
emphasis on
repatriation. Yeah, I think there's a few things in a sense. I mean, so there's this idea because we now have this remote sensing ability to look underground that we don't have to excavate sites. And I want to be very clear that is not true. We absolutely have to excavate sites because we actually analyze the materials that we find, right? We cannot do isotope or DNA analysis without actually collecting samples. And so what that means is archaeology is slowly becoming more and more less about what the public thinks of as excavation and more about sampling. How do we properly sample something? And that actually ties into how do you understand old excavations, right? Because what you often try to do is, all right, August Mao excavated Pompeii, this insula in the 19th century. We're going to go in there and we're going to open up a window that samples stuff with new methods that helps us reinterpret his excavations even. And so that's where we're becoming more and more sophisticated, is analyzing the previous things. A lot of scholars say that archaeology of the future will be excavating our storerooms, because we have so many materials in storerooms that have not been studied in up-to-date ways, or even not studied at all, because people were clearing stuff so fast. So many artifacts were recovered that people didn't even study them. And in some cases, they just threw them out because they didn't realize people would care about animal bones or plainware pottery or the dirt itself and what's in the dirt that tells us a lot about what's going on.
The context has all been
and
completely...
So, I think we're slowing down how we excavate. We have been for a while. We're going to continue to slow down. And I think the real key is we're always going to come up with different sampling procedures. And it's always about what's your question about that specific context, and therefore what's your sampling methods for that specific context. And so I don't always want to say that we leave stuff behind because of new technologies. We sometimes leave stuff behind because we'd excavated it in a different way. So like when you're excavating, even today, if you're excavating, say, a room, and your goal is to excavate the whole room to understand what's going on there. Really commonly, not everybody excavates this way. There's different ways to excavate, but one common way to do it is to excavate half the room first, or a portion of it. You get a window through the different layers that exist, which then lets you develop a hypothesis that you can test by excavating the rest of the room. Does that make sense? And so that's actually really important. That's part of why we do that, because like I said yesterday, it's this negotiation between the fact that archaeology is deductive and inductive. And so we need to deal with the fact that we recover material, but then we want to approach it in a deductive way. And that's why you then leave material to excavate again, if you see what I mean.
It feels like it feels like a long time ago, like sciences, I think, I might be making this up. Maybe I'm repeating pseudoscience. So like, I think everything was just like philosophy. And then eventually people started to branch more narrowly and more specialized into kind of different fields to do investigations. And then now it feels like things are branching out again, where every field is starting to borrow from every other field. Where for, like psychology and medicine and like neurobiology, like all of these things are starting to borrow and mix. And it sounds like for archaeology, like it's starting to borrow from other disciplines too, that you might want people with other types of specializations also to have some input on how you excavate a site or how you evaluate a thing.
Yeah.
Or is archaeology an industry specifically that's kind of always been a little bit more interdisciplinary? Yeah,
it's that one. And so we've always, in fact, it's one of the things I'm teaching archaeological theory this year. And like one of the key things that you teach students is, look, most of what we do comes from other fields. Like when the way we excavate comes from geology, thinking about strata and the way things are deposited. Understanding construction comes from architecture and engineering.
Carbon dating.
Carbon dating comes from physics and chemistry. I do organic chemistry on stuff and biology and anatomy, and it's really always been that way. Now, that said, there still is a coherent body of archaeological theory. It's why you can't just be a chemist and start doing archaeology, because you don't understand the context in which we interpret evidence. And so, there's a very coherent body of archaeological theory that oftentimes, but it mostly comes from understanding the history of the field and how it developed and how we ask questions and answer questions from this kind of evidence that doesn't speak. We're the ones that make, that make words from this kind of evidence, and so
would you say that's kind of like one of the maybe like the epistemic axioms of the field? So like psychology, one of the like central ways that we understand psychology versus sociology is we look at the individual out, right? Like we're concerned with the individual, and then psychology might build out from there, but we focus here, where sociology tends to start at society and large group levels, and they work down towards the individual. What would you say is like kind of the epistemic system or way of thinking in archaeology?
I mean, we do both of those for sure. Meaning we sometimes focus on the individual, like when we have an individual burial or something like that, or we will, do DNA testing. We can do isotope testing to see if that individual migrated. We can understand their diet. But then once we've done that on hundreds of individuals from these cultures, we can start putting together a sociological look and those kind of big data patterns. And so, but I do think that the main epistemic sort of way of looking at the archaeological record is understanding deeply the context in which is embedded.
Context.
And the context, by the way, is a really tricky term, especially to teach students. And the reason why is because we think of context in two different ways. One is the physical context. It came from that specific layer. We need to understand that specific layer. I've talked about dog gnawing or different kinds of things that could bias what comes from a specific layer. So we need to understand the physical context really, really closely. But at the same time, you have to understand that these artifacts have a social context that they existed in the past. And so we need to then interpret them within our understanding of the larger social context within which they existed. And so the context really is the main key, and how we define context, of course, is going to vary based on the questions we ask, but we need to be aware of the different ways that are appropriate for defining context.
An example that I think is really funny that I don't know how widespread this was. I remember reading something about it, recently, but, fact check where necessary. But there was, I believe it was an excavation being done somewhere in Latin America, and they were finding these homes, and the homes all had like knives that were put on like top of doorways or on top of windows and stuff like that. And everyone was trying to figure out like, why the hell are there knives up here? Was this like a ceremonial thing? Was this like some sort of superstition or something? And there was a woman on the dig who was a mother, and she was like, no, they were doing that to keep the knives away from the children. Like, you can't just leave that on the ground. Someone's going to get hurt. So like they were probably putting it up there for safekeeping so someone doesn't get hurt with it. So like little things like that, where that is also, an artifact's context, both socially and physically. And that's something I try and talk about a lot in my videos, because it really is. It's a thing you learn in your A&T 101 class, like you're talking about here, where it's like, it's really important to drill that into your head, that like, if I gave you that knife in a box and I told you to tell me about it, you'd be like, I don't know, it's a knife, it's made of this material, it's this big, looks pretty old. But like, other than that, you can't tell me much. If you saw it, where it was, is it above a doorway? Is it buried in the ground? Is it with a skeleton? Is it next to the skeleton? Is there damage to the skeleton? Like, you'd be able to tell so much more about it. So that's why, and Flint, I'm really glad you brought this up, is that I think a big change that we'll probably see in archaeology, and it's something that's ongoing, is slowing down the excavations. Like when we talk about like only 5% of Göbekli Tepe is excavated, we need to demand that they excavate the rest. It's like, A, no, because we don't have the technology for it, and B, every grain of sand you pull out of that can tell you something. So you have to go through it painstakingly. Like, you are going through these sites with a fine-tooth comb. Every layer of soil, every stone needs to be inspected in order to be able to gain as much information from it as possible, because once you move it, the context has been destroyed. So it's really important to be like overly methodical with this, because you get one shot at having it in the context that it was originally in.
It's like a crime scene.
Exactly. It's like a crime scene. It's like a crime scene.
In our conversation, I think we brought up the what is a woman thing, or was that in our talk?
I don't think we brought it up.
I don't know.
At all.
I brought it was something. It was one of you two. You guys forgot. Okay.
Bastards.
But the basically the idea that like when you begin like your first forays into philosophy, you kind of realize that there are a whole bunch of things that we kind of take for granted about like how things are, and contexts are things that are almost impossible subjectively to divorce yourself from, because you live in them so much. But like even what you're talking about in terms of a knife, like I could show you like a steak knife, and you would see it, and your immediate association would be, this is cutlery for food, obviously. And I could show you a duller blade that would be less effective at killing, but it's got like a handle, and you'd see it like that's combat 100%. Why? Like, it's not, the utility is divorced here completely. Like, one is obviously sharper and you could kill easily with it than the other one. But like, just because of the shapes associated with it and the virtue of like holding it in a particular way, you would associate it with combat. And that is taken for granted that 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, somebody might see it and they might have a totally different mind. Like, these people were savages. Like, every single household had a tool full of weaponry for war.
Yeah.
And even like the children had plastic training weapons to use. And it's like
plastic guns.
Yeah.
I read something that was so funny and so interesting. And it was the idea of, I don't know who wrote this. It might even just been a Reddit post, I don't remember, but somebody's writing from like how horrifying it could be potentially for aliens to stumble upon humans, and like all of the crazy things that we're capable of, like incisors and teeth that can like tear into flesh but like grind it in the back, and like skin that protects you from every external environment without the need for specialized things to go into water to be in the, like there are all these things, but for us we just see people like it's just like a normal thing, and we don't even think about it.
And our natural defenses also kind of suck compared to other things. Like our teeth, it's like, you know, the only thing we really got going for us is this. Like, we don't have big claws, and we don't have like.
Maybe
we have friends.
We have cool physical things. We run a lot.
We run a lot. That's true. Upright and running and stamina. Oh my god, we will run your ass off a cliff.
And opposable thumbs are pretty cool too.
Opposable thumbs are cool.
And our bodies are very adaptable.
Like
yeah, our arms are cool. You build models for like one day, and you will appreciate the complexity of like human joints. We're like, oh my god, we actually have so many different points of flexibility and everything.
Move all over the place.
We can climb trees. We can throw things.
My girlfriend's dog is like, you know, like sub 25 pounds, and like when you go to pick her up, like, you know, she'll crumple a little bit, but she's so like stiff, like her little legs, you know, and like they're all sticking out like this. I'm like, you don't like bend. Like if you picked up, you know, a child,
like a cat.
They'd be like, a cat, they're just like, you know. So our flexibility is pretty good, I guess.
One thing that actually made me think of, I was going to ask about it before, which is like the taken for granted, but also one thing that I think a lot is probably a key part of context is like what we don't write down. Like I think about, you know, what we like don't write down in modern worlds. Like we don't write down, for example, like how our kitchen have a whole bunch, like there's so many things that we take for granted about like how things work in our world that are just like known facts.
Ephemera.
And we have, and what like the most literate society that's ever existed in human history, right? And so like if you go back to even like an era where writing's just being developed or stuff, how much less. It makes me think of you know, like the sword fighting guys who try to reenact FEMA or something like that, where they reenact old style like knight fight sword fighting. There's an art to it. Do you know what it's called? HEMA?
No.
Or something like that. Okay.
It's supposed to counteract the idea that a long time ago, people just walked around in these huge things of armor with swords and unwieldily kind of like threw at each other. When in reality, they were probably a lot more mobile and flexible. And
probably a lot of that stuff was ceremonial. And so that was sort of what I wanted to bring up, is that there's this idea that there's like one interpretation of a building or a artifact, right? And that's, so there's a problem with that, but some of it is also bringing our own baggage to it. So there's this site on Crete, Atsipades, where the excavator kept finding these little clay figurines that looked like this.
Little duder.
Yeah, so he interpreted them as phalluses. Right? You know, so they're long with a little
that was my first
circle
guess.
on
I would
top.
guess a board game, but you know, it's fine.
Then they did some more excavation, and somebody realized actually that fits onto a human figurine, not as a phallus, it's a fist. And so, you know, you need that larger context to interpret an artifact. But at the same time, we also need to understand that a lot of things that seem to us as having one interpretation, they can be used in different ways at different times. Like, right, do you only drink coffee out of a coffee mug? Right? Do you only drink wine out of a wine glass? Right? There's different things that we use in different contexts. Like, we're in an apartment now, but are we living here? You know what I mean? And so if we take this sort of one-dimensional understanding of an artifact and we say, oh, that's a wine cup because we have it painted on there and we know that that looks exactly like a wine cup, but hey, it's used in different contexts in different ways. And we need to understand that. And same thing with a building. You know, an archaeologist, when I go to a site, I look at it totally differently than a tourist would, right? If you go and you look at sorry to keep bringing up the Parthenon in Athens, but you go see that. Temple to Athena, lovely columns, they worshipped Athena there, right? Dude, that building has a 2,000-year plus history to it. At one point, it was a church. At another point, it was a mosque. Did you know that still to this day, it's cleverly hidden by conservators who want to present it as a temple, but in the corner of it, there's still a medieval tower that has stairs and a spiral staircase that you can go up to the top of. I've been at the top, and you can look down into the Parthenon because the entire Acropolis was a medieval fortress. And in fact, you know, there was this giant tower right at the entrance to the Acropolis, a total medieval tower. You want to know who knocked it down, who lobbied to knock it down? Heinrich Schliemann. Because it was an eyesore. Heinrich Schliemann was the guy who discovered Troy. He was one of the
Oh
very
my
first
God.
archaeologists ever. The guy who like basically dynamited through Troy and like destroyed it, right? He also was the guy, one of the first excavators at Mycenae. And so, you know, he also stole a lot of treasure and put it on his wife and took photographs of it. He was not a good dude. And so he wanted, he lived in Athens. His grave is still in Athens in the National Cemetery. I've been to it. And he and other archaeologists in the 19th century, they wanted to destroy that tower because they wanted it to look like the classical past. They wanted to ignore the Ottoman past, the medieval past. They wanted it to be ancient Greece. But when I go there, I'm interested in that whole dynamic
Yeah, the
history that's
history.
there, right?
Yeah.
That's what we study.
I was saying even more so, you might see it in one way, but another archaeologist that might have studied a different time period might see it in another way.
Exactly,
completely,
and
yeah.
they should. We all complement each other to be able to construct the past with different questions and methods and thoughts, and that's really important. And it all comes back to seeing it in that context, right? And you know, and a lot of people think that archaeology is common sense. And so one of the examples I use to argue against that is, again, Heinrich Schliemann has this notebook page from his publication on Troy, and he's digging deep into Troy, and he opens up this like room that has never been in for like the last like 3,000 years. And in there he finds these live toads. Right? And his explanation for it is that these toads actually come from the period of these Homeric heroes at Troy. And they've survived that whole time in that area because he was the first person to open it up.
Duh.
That was his common sense and they were alive still. They weren't like new generations. They lived that whole time. That's how he published it, because at that time that was his common sense.
Wait, like they were like vampire toads that just
Yeah,
like, lived
yeah,
for 3,000
yeah.
years?
Toads are biologically immortal. If nothing kills them, they don't die.
And then on the same page, he describes swastikas on the pottery and talks about Aryan super civilizations.
Oh,
and so
I
this is
didn't
the
know
kind
that.
of common sense
Wow.
that takes a lot of effort to understand that archaeology is not common sense. It's built on all these hypotheses that have come over the last 200 years that have been tested and refuted, new discoveries and whatnot, and the ways that we interpret stuff. It's not
I would
common sense
argue
at all.
one of the biggest tells for pseudo anything is anytime somebody uses the phrase common sense, you can almost completely out of hand dismiss everything they have to say about
Yeah, I think that's true.
One thing, have you seen, I don't know, there's like a meme that goes around of like if archaeologists found like rabbit bones, like, you know, 200 years ago, and it's like got like a rabbit bone and then like the skin is like super tight and close
Oh, I've
because
seen
like
that.
the way that we understand the image of like a T-Rex, for example, from its skeletal structure might not be, I think there was like a mummified dinosaur that really changed how we understood at least that specific breed of dinosaur looked because it had its skin on. We're like, oh, there's a lot of extra skin and hide than we otherwise expected and stuff. I'm super curious, like, I really want to ask about dinosaurs, mostly because I'm obsessed with dinosaurs. I guess, like, how often do you think that that's the case where essentially, like, new discoveries kind of, like, shift and shape these types of things, especially for, like, extinct species or extinct cultures that, like, we have basically no context in the modern world to begin to understand?
Yeah, that's a tough question.
There's a cool example that I can kind of think of is, again, you know, I'm no paleontologist, so I won't be able to tell you too much about dinosaurs other than just, you know, just armchair
cool, yeah.
expert. Yeah. But one that I think is kind of interesting is Ice Age horses from Europe. So
Wait, real quick, when is the Ice Age?
the Ice Age, you could say it kind of ended in the last glacial period ended about 15,000 years ago.
Okay.
So the last
yeah.
Ice Age would be between like 120 and 20,000 years ago. Is that about right? That's the last.
And then when did the comet or the asteroid that destroyed the dinosaurs?
65 million years ago. So very long time ago. Yeah.
They're really close to
But
each other.
this ice age that we are in right now has been going on for about the last 2 million years. So it's cycles of glacial periods and then interglacial periods. So we're in an interglacial period right now. That's why we have winter.
It's also why we understand that global warming is actually happening, because we actually should be slowly, not like right away, we should actually be going back to a cold
Yeah,
period.
we're kind of at the end
and
of our-
instead we are getting warmer and warmer and warmer.
So it cycles like
exponentially.
20,000 years or
Yeah,
so,
well, it
basically?
varies 5 to 20,000 years are these interglacial periods.
Yeah, and the glacial periods are long.
Yeah,
They're very
yeah.
long.
Yeah,
They're like
you said like
yeah,
it
they're
sounded
like
like
100,000
years.
So the place I'm going with that was horses. We have, you know, a whole bunch of horse bones from all over Europe. I'm sure you could talk about this extensively.
excavated some of them.
Yeah, there you go. This guy found some. But like you said, when you find a horse bone, you only know that it was a horse. You don't really know anything else about like what it looked like. And so one of the ways that they've been able to reconstruct, or at least be able to interpret what the horses looked like is through cave art. So there's cave art throughout Europe that shows horses painted by people who lived around these horses, and they have different coats. So some of them are different colors. They have speckles. Some of them have like, like they have like a different color on one part than they do on the other part. And like they can make a map of Europe based on all these horse paintings and sort of get an idea for like what the different coats of horses looked like because of those paintings, which we wouldn't have been able to know if we only had the bones.
This might, I don't know if we've seen the same thing or not, but or it might have even been a comic I saw or something, but it was like basically like paleontologists are the first ones to discover horses, and then the drawings of the horses are these horrific creatures with like scales and shit. And I think the argument was, and I don't know if this is true or not, but that there isn't really a good reason to think that that dinosaurs were all scaly, horrible creatures. Some of them could have been furry, some of them could have had feathers.
I think feathers is a big one.
Feathers is
yeah,
the
yeah.
one
In
right
fact,
now.
But we just
you know,
never imagine any of them
I'm
to
not a
look that way.
paleontologist at all, but I don't study dinosaurs, but I do
guess-
study ancient animals.
Yeah.
And so, go on.
Oh, I was just going to ask, how do we have you seen medieval paintings of cats?
Yeah, they are
Right?
terrifying
Like if
with
we
the eyes
used
and the,
if we
yeah.
used those as an idea, if cats went extinct or whatever, as like what cats look like, then cats are like monsters, like they're horrifying looking. So I get that we can get like coat colors and stuff, but obviously like a lot of the cave paintings make like big round bellies, whereas it might be hard to know, like, were they like big, thick, and drafty, like the Icelandic ponies, or are they like more skinny and slender, or are we not really
That's
able to
your
determine
wheelhouse.
that?
Yeah, so we have
Yeah.
to be really careful of using art and using modern misconceptions.
Yeah.
Art we know is actually culturally created, and like I have this fun Twitter thread on people drawing lions, and it's clear that a lot of them never seen a lion, right? It's just really clear.
Yeah,
But
description
lions
of a
are just
lion.
Like a human nose.
such an
Yeah.
important component of ancient art that even if you've seen a lion or not, you're going to draw it, right? Or paint it on a pot or whatever it is. And so we do need to be very careful because we can see biases in art and stuff like that. And we can start correcting some of that today with DNA to understand that. But a good example is horses, in fact, and more recent horses. You own horses, as you said.
I do.
And so we have this picture of horses as these really large, and I've studied a bunch of ancient horses, like buried horses outside of Athens. I've studied like 15 of them or so.
Like the little guys, right? Like the
Well, they're all
smaller-
little is the point.
Yeah.
And what we think of as a war horse in the past was the size of what we would call a pony today. And there's some of my...
Which, to be clear for viewers, ponies are not just children horses.
Yeah,
No,
it's a
a lot of people think a
no.
pony
It
is a
has to
smaller
do with
breed
how
of
many
horse.
hands they are.
Pony
how
never
large
means
they are.
baby horse. That's
Yeah.
a full, anyways.
And so we can...
Just to be clear, pony never means baby horse.
Not at all. It has to do with the
Misinformation.
size. Yeah.
It's funny
Debunked.
that we've got a guy
Yeah.
here who looks like Bosch for talking about horses.
No,
And
stop.
so all of our thoughts on what horses are totally wrong because they're all modern breeds.
Right.
It's only in the last few hundred years that what we think of as horses have come about. Same thing with dogs.
Yeah, yeah.
Like same thing with cats. Same thing with everything. What we think of as these animals that we see just 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, they were totally different.
This is true of almost every biological thing. It's also very true of fruit and vegetables
Yes.
as well.
Yes,
That they-
yes.
paintings of watermelons from like even just like I don't know, like 400 years ago. There's one in the MFA in Boston, and like it's it's cut in half, and it's all like white rind with like 4 segments of like the red flesh of the watermelon. Looks completely different. I'm sure you guys have all seen the little the maize versus wheat, or like what ended up turning into corn. Like it was one little stalk with like a
That's
couple
what I brought on
kernels
Joe Rogan, was a little
alternating. Yeah, you
ancient
put
cob.
that
Yeah.
up. Yeah. So like it's amazing how much that stuff has changed, and I'm sure you've heard this one, and you probably could even add a little bit more to it. But I saw something funny recently in the topic of things that are just lost if they're not written down. Is there's this really old I don't know, it's some like Nordic dictionary or something like that, as far back as dictionaries go. And the definition for a horse is everyone knows what a horse is. And so if there were no horses, if all the horses were gone and we read that, we'd be like, well, I don't know what a horse is, so.
It's common sense.
Yeah, it's common sense.
exactly.
Everyone's
But to
seen
them
a
it
horse.
was, right?
Yeah.
Everyone
Yeah.
knew what a
Knew what it
horse
was.
was.
I mean, there's the breed of dog. I saw something about this recently. I do think it was literally just like a post. So again, I need to look into this a little bit more. But it's this breed of dog from like medieval Europe that was really small, and it was like bred to like run on a wheel to like rotate like a spit
yeah.
I
over
think
a
it's more
fire.
19th century, 18th century.
19th century.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
There's
yeah.
like
So a little
images
bit
of
more,
it, yeah.
more recently, but like it was a dog that was bred for that. It was seen as kind of just like a workhorse kind of thing. So nobody bothered to keep it as a pet or like breed it a bunch, and it just like died
write
off,
about
and
it.
it's just gone, or write about it. Yeah. So it's like we have a few drawings and a few pictures, and like none of that dog anymore. So it's like if we didn't have that, it would just be totally lost because it was deemed so ordinary that like why would I even bother writing that down? Yeah.
What do you think is the first time, or when is the first time in history where somebody was concerned with preserving things for like future civilizations. So I'm sure at some point people are drawing things or writing things for their family. And then I'm sure at some point people in court are like, well, for future governments. When do you think is the first time in history somebody is like, at some point our civilization will fail or fall? And I want people way off in the future to have an understanding of this. Do you think that's a really recent thing in the past few hundred years? Or?
No, God, no. I mean, I don't think the concept of civilization falling is necessarily the concept, but you can even read, Herodotus or Thucydides, the first Greek historians, and
Give
they
me
talk
years about this for people at home that don't know.
Sorry, this is from like the 5th century BC, so 400s BC.
Okay.
And these two historians are writing very specifically. Thucydides starts off his history of the Peloponnesian Wars, the war between Athens and Sparta, and he says this is a record for future people, so that they understand what happened, why it happened, how it happened, and they can learn from it.
And you think when he says future people, he's not thinking of people like his great-grandchildren. He's thinking of like a future people, capital P.
Like
Like
Because, at that point, they already had these kind of oral histories, which aren't really histories, but mythology, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? And even then, the entire goal of the Iliad is Achilles chooses undying glory and fame that will be remembered through the ages. And he makes that choice consciously. He wants to be remembered, if you see what I mean, down centuries and centuries and centuries. And, so people back then, they had this concept of the deep past as well. And they would even go throughout this period in Greek history and prehistory, they would go and have tomb cult. They go into graves of people that were living hundreds of years ago. Sometimes we think it's to claim the land, to say that this was my ancestor, right? Even though it might not be. And so there is that concept of preserving memory, into the future. Very, very early, and I imagine it existed far before people wrote it down as well.
So in oral tradition. And
to preserve that. Now, there's all kinds of issues with oral tradition. It's a fantastic device for remembering the past, but we can see how an oral story like the Iliad or the Odyssey, it picks up details over the centuries. I forget if I said this to you guys about how, in one line you have a spear that is a Bronze Age style spear, and then in the next line it becomes an Iron Age style spear. And, you have the boar's tusked helmets that are Bronze Age style. You have different shields that match different periods. And so this oral tradition picks up this kind of material culture that we can date because we've now excavated it. But to them, it didn't really matter. It was this world of anachronisms in many ways, and it wasn't a problem.
One thinking thought, a way that I wish people would consider things is sometimes things are not correct, but I think people falsely assume sometimes that if a thing is incorrect, that it's random or arbitrary. And like what you just said, sometimes people can be incorrect about things. This is true even of like political propaganda. But when people are wrong about things, or they're saying a thing that's not exactly true, there's a reason why they're saying it. And sometimes somebody being incorrect about a thing could even give you more evidence to the intent or what's going on than them just stating a fact.
It's how we actually understood that this was an oral poetry. Right? It was Milman Parry who did ethnography of oral poetry in the Balkans. And then he went back and reread the Odyssey and the Iliad. He's like, oh shit, they keep repeating these phrases and these terms to match a poetic meter. That's how oral stuff comes about. And then they developed that whole hypothesis, and since then we keep testing it, and we find these archaeological signatures that show that it's this oral thing. And so, exactly, these unintentional things, these anachronisms, are part of the history of those poems, just like the cross on the statue, right? This is all part of the lively, dynamic history of these, texts or materials or whatever. And so, that's really important to understand. It's also why when we make a movie and we have anachronisms in it, dude, that's fine. Anachronisms have always existed.
Yeah.
That's part of stories.
And that's also, I think we're touching on something important because the idea of storytelling and mythos is a huge tool in the conspiracy theorist toolbox. Like that is just like piece number one is, you don't need to have any evidence of that lost advanced globe spanning civilization if you have a story from this place and this place that both talk about a flood and a hero. Like, that's it. That's all you need. And like, it's ridiculous. It is. I mean, like, I don't, that is not enough evidence.
Well, floods only happen in the Mediterranean. They've literally never happened anywhere
and
else on the
only
planet.
at the end of the Ice Age.
And
only
it's a global flood.
Yeah.
I mean, my always defense against that is like, do you remember Hurricane Katrina? How about Fukushima? One by a tsunami, one by a hurricane, all these floods that created all these stories in history for different reasons.
Yes.
People in the future might link that to global warming and sea level rise. They'd be wrong, right?
Yeah.
To say that every flood is part of the same event is ridiculous.
Yeah, it didn't happen. And so like that's I think the thing that is really frustrating, because many of the kind of conspiracy people, when they are trying to at least act reverent of, indigenous cultures and things like that, will be like, see, we're actually listening to the mythos, and like, it's archaeologists who are just saying this is worthless, which like no archaeologist is saying that's worthless. That's complete horseshit. But like, what they're doing is they're generalizing to such a level that it ends up becoming incredibly disrespectful, because you are just looking at it at face value. A really interesting example that I love is one of the indigenous groups of the Pacific Northwest. They have a story that the like eagle spirit was like fighting with like the whale spirit, and in that battle the eagle picked the whale up from the ocean and dropped it, and when it dropped the whale into the ocean, it made this huge splash that like wiped out the people on the shore. Well, we have evidence now that around that time was when the fault line slipped, and there was a tsunami that inundated all the low-lying areas in like the Pacific Northwest, and that was their explanation for it. So like that is a great example of an indigenous oral history that is recording a real event. In in Massachusetts, I was just in Martha's Vineyard recently, and I went to visit some of the cultural sites for the Akina Wampanoag people, and in speaking with them, they were talking about the oral histories of like they have an oral record of when Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket separated from like the mainland, like when the sea level slowly rose enough that like eventually it was separated, they became two islands, Nantucket Sound flooded. Like those are all real stories. They're told through great leaders. I can't remember what the name was of the leader that was present in all these, but it explains the colors of the cliffs. It explains why it was his footprint that like squashed the land down and allowed the water to flow in and stuff like that. So these are all incredibly important anthropological tools, but the disrespect that comes from the pseudoscientists is that they are generalizing it to be all part of one big story that is being taken at face value, and in doing so removes not only the cultural context but the like scientific and educational context that is baked into all of these stories.
I'm super curious. Do you feel like there's I feel like every discipline is going to be privy to its own common fallacies and thinking errors that people within the industry will probably be both simultaneously blind to and constantly being like, oh yeah, I have to remember this is a really common thinking error. So for example, I always talk about like specialty obsession. So anytime you like start getting into like a mental health focus, it's like if you research addiction, everything's addiction. If you research narcissism, everything's narcissism, right? And it can be really important if you're like hyper specialized to like step back and be like, hold on, is this narcissism or is this just like my specialty bias, like kind of pulling in? Do you think that there's any common like thinking errors or biases within archaeology that you have to be mindful of, or is like a common like error within kind of classically trained archaeologists?
I think the lack of astrophysics studying means you guys never even consider aliens, which is a huge disappointment.
Dude, you're so right.
Sorry, go ahead.
Dang. Yeah, I think that's our big blind spot is aliens.
And astronomy. You said you have no astronomy, so.
Well, we do have astronomy. There's plenty of archaeoastronomy.
Yeah.
So one of the I've emphasized a few times, one of the cool things about archaeology is just how interdisciplinary it is, and it's not just super interdisciplinary. It's international. And so, what that means is there's so many different schools of thought on how to do archaeology. Greek archaeologists do things different from German archaeologists, who do things different from American archaeologists. A zooarchaeologist who studies animal remains is doing stuff differently from a ceramicist who's studying the pottery, who's doing something different from the architect person who's studying the architecture. And so, to a certain degree, that major heterogeneity of the field itself, it means that if there are these kind of blind spots and these fallacies, they exist in a microcosm within a subdiscipline. You know what I mean? And we do find examples of that. The best example of that is, of course, the change from Clovis first to understanding that pre-Clovis cultures existed in the Americas, right? And so you can see, it's really clear if you look through the history of this, that there was clearly a logical fallacy from many of the archaeologists who studied the peopling of the Americas at the, in the 70s, 80s, and up until the 90s. And so, they refused to accept some of the evidence that was constantly being presented one side after another that overturned eventually overturned that hypothesis of Clovis first, and we now know people came to the Americas earlier. But that is such a small portion of the field. Almost nobody studies the peopling of the Americas, if you see what I mean. It's just a very tiny group of people that specialize in that very specific topic. Me, I study Greek archaeology. I could care less in terms of like my output of scholarship on when the first people arrived in the Americas. And some people say, well, archaeologists shut down these new ideas. No, there were a handful of people that were not accepting of them, and then they eventually accepted them, right? And so, you know, even American archaeologists, meaning people who specialize on the archaeology of America, most of them don't study the earliest people there.
Yeah,
they study
very
colonial
specific.
periods, they study archaic periods, they study people from 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. So they had no horse in that race either. And so, you know, those kind of blind spots, therefore, are going to be fairly context-based, if you see what I mean. And I do think there's several. I could think of a lot for Greek archaeology, right? In Greek archaeology, we have way too much confidence in the ceramic-style dates that we get, and we need to do more radiocarbon dating, right? And it's just part of the tradition of how Greek and Roman archaeology is done. And it's slowly changing, but that's so hyper-local to the Mediterranean. Everywhere else, they're doing radiocarbon dating nonstop. And so, you know, it's these very local traditions that have these blinders on, but then somebody from outside sort of says, wait a second, you know, in the Americas, we don't do it this way, and this is why. Maybe you guys should be doing more of that. And then they slowly start changing and start doing more of that.
Yeah, and it's like you said, it's hyper local and it's very like niche specific. Like they, you know, a lot of the pseudo people really cling to that whole like Clovis first thing as an example of like when big archaeology was wrong. And it's like most archaeologists have absolutely no like study in Clovis culture. Like there are so many civilizations around so much of the world spanning every time period, and then like specialists within each element of any one of those civilizations at any given time. It's like, it isn't just like archaeology as a whole is like, you know, all studying Clovis culture. Like slow developments were made. When those developments were made, there was discussion within the field to prove or disprove the new discovery. And then like, you know, things were either changed or not changed based on the evidence. And it's within that niche, it's within that hyper-localized field. And like, it's very easy for a lot of the kind of alt history crowd to cling to that as a opportunity to throw the baby out with the bathwater of like, hey, in this example of this place, like, you know, this was wrong, and therefore, like, it would be like saying, you know, like the Ford Pinto, if it gets rear-ended, it will explode. We can't drive cars. Like cars are unsafe, they are dangerous, like, and they could be wrong. They are always going to be wrong, and like there is implicit biases in making cars that are going to put us in danger. It's like, no, that was like one manufacturer with one make and model of car in a specific year that comes down to a specific part, and that was resolved within that field, and the changes were made because that's how development happens. So like, it is ridiculous to take like one thing that has changed because of research in the field. I will highlight again, all these changes are made by archaeologists, they're not made by other people, and then, you know, to use that as an opportunity to be like, and so everything must be wrong. That is just ridiculous.
The formalization of this might be called the nirvana fallacy, I'm not sure, but it's very frustrating when you have like a real messy system that has produced good results, but like there are errors, but people will point to mistakes in it, and then they propose some hypothetical never existed system, and like, what about that or that? I was like, yeah, they were wrong there. Wow, you made a lot of mistakes, right? Yeah, but also modern civilization. Like, what did we do?
What do you think? You think physicists have said the same thing in the last 100 years? They've changed drastically.
Yeah,
Science.
like, congratulations. Like, you drink medicine 200 years ago, they drank mercury when they were sick. Like, what the f- you want? Like,
no, they're like, archaeology's all wrong because they keep changing their minds on stuff. And it's like, dude, every single field of study updates what it's doing as it goes on. And just to emphasize how different things are, could you guys, like, think about it. You have a room and you want to excavate it, right? There are so many different ways to excavate that room. And every person in charge of how to excavate that room is going to do it differently. So, like, you know, and like I said, it has to do with national stuff as well. So, you know, what the Germans do is they excavate in 5 centimeter what are called spits. So they'll take off 5 centimeters, another 5 centimeters, another 5 centimeters, and collect each 5 centimeter stuff together, right? What the people from the UK will do is they'll do what's called an open context system. They don't care about going down 5 centimeters at a time. They want to see when the soil layer changes, and then they'll stop and collect stuff differently with the next layer. What Americans will do is they'll divide the room in two, and they'll do it the British way for half of it. Then they'll check the profile and see if the stratigraphy is correct and excavate it a second time. And so based on the way that you're brought up on how to excavate impacts how you collect that data. And so that's why, it is so heterogeneous. And that's why we don't have just the same blinders on, if you see what I mean. Because we're all doing things differently. Even different labs that do DNA or isotopes or whatever, the way we do it at Cardiff is different from how they do it in Brussels, and so it's just like we have our own lab culture of how we do things, right? And since I was trained in the Cardiff way of doing isotopes, if I set up an isotope lab somewhere else, I'll replicate, in a sense, that way of doing it with the Cardiff lab. Also, I'm developing some of my own methods, so that'll then change things. And that makes things difficult to piece things together, but it also helps prevent some of these blinders, if you see what I mean, because we're all doing it very differently.
And I wish people in general try to encourage people to think, you should always be thinking in terms of pros and cons, not in better and worse, because there's usually a pro to almost everything.
I don't like the German system of excavation. Because it ignores
Which one's better?
If we had
Which one's
Heimlich
better?
Nick digging person, okay, I bet he would have really good arguments for
I
why
love
their
some
system
of my
is better.
German colleagues, but I think that way of
Their
excavating
excavation
is an issue in my mind, because you're mixing up stuff from different strata if you have two strata in that five, but whatever.
And the sort of like homogeneous nature of archaeology is something that almost works against it for the pseudo-archaeology people, because it gives them an opportunity to be like, hey, there was times where they were wrong, or there were times where like things were changed. And so that just gives them, like the little niche in the armor that they can just like find a way through, because in their eyes, they view it as being the complete opposite, where it's like they have the answer. The capital T answer, and like that is like the thing that they have found, and their philosophy and ideology does not revolve around like developing your understanding as you go. They start with the conclusion, and then they just find whatever piece of evidence they can to fill it in. Which science can work like that, where it's like, I have a theory that X, so I'm going to do this, that, this, and the other thing until I either prove or disprove that theory. But archaeology is a little different because it's very experimental, where you can still have theories and there's still hypotheses, but like you excavate and you make interpretations based on what you're finding. But like with a lot of the pseudo crowd, they think that there needs to be the answer, and that just isn't how it works. So in doing that, in archaeology being a field that is immensely interdisciplinary, in it being a field that has so many different locations and so many different niches, it is something that is really, really flexible. And the irony in the way that you can see that a lot of the pseudo archaeology crowd views the way that it should be as being very like cut and dry is because they accuse archaeologists of doing that. The amount of times that they're like, well, hey, you said this and now it's this. And the big one of being like, well, it's, an ivory tower and they don't listen to anyone outside of their field and they don't communicate with anyone. It's like, no, you're doing that. Like archaeology is founded. The principle of archaeology is interdisciplinary because it is not enough to just go to a site and dig it up. I don't know anything about animal bones. I don't know how to do radiocarbon dating. We need those people, and we need archaeologists because they know how to bring all of that different research from different fields together to apply it. It is literally the study of all of like human history. Like that is an immense field with so many different parts of it that you need a lot of broad specialties to bring in.
And there's conceptual confusion there too between like a hypothesis and a conclusion.
Yeah.
Right? Because a hypothesis is, you imagine you need a hypothesis to begin basically any scientific investigation. Generally, or at least for experimentation, you have to have some idea what I think I'm going to test. But there's a difference between having that and then testing it and then either being able to accept or reject the hypothesis versus the conclusion, which can never be rejected. It just means you did the experiment wrong. They're two different things. And the people that come in with the pseudoscientific views are doing what their imagined opponents are doing, which is where they think they have one, like they are the ivory tower in their brain, where they reject all external criticism. They reject all other forms of approach. And you can tell this too, because like the hypothesis never updates. It's just that the experiment updates. Like, oh, well, you think that you did this thing and you didn't find that? Well, we need to do it a different way and find it a different way, because like they're never
it's
changing
still there
their
to be
mind.
found.
Exactly. Yeah.
And a really good example of this, and especially this is where understanding the history of the field really matters, is something like stone tools. So you have stone tools made of flint, for example. I flake really well. I'm flaky. But no, though. So like, look, the issue is how do you?
I don't know about flaky. You do come off as a tool. I'm just. I'm sorry. That's my
I'm out of here.
Thanks for coming on, everybody.
We got our 2 hours. Get out. Go ahead.
But it's like sort of like, how do you tell the difference between just a rock and a stone tool? Something that was human made. And so, I had this conversation with Graham and Joe Rogan on there, sort of like, we're looking at this stuff and it's like, and they're like, well, yeah, but it has like a straight line here. Like that looks human made to me. And it's like, look, we have a long history of trying to figure out what is human-made versus not human-made, and therefore we reject anything unless we're sure of it. And so when you're talking about like a stone tool made of flint, there are very specific criteria that we have. We understand how it fractures, and based on how it fractures, it creates these ripples of force. So you see these ripples in the fracture, you see the bulb of percussion, and then you see the platform that was struck. And if you don't have those kind of things, or the negative of those kind of things, because you can get it where a piece was struck off, you cannot say that it's a stone tool. Instead, it's just a random breakage in it. Because, and you know, my dad built a robot. He built a robot that he named Igor, where it actually napped stone tools methodically to understand the fracture pattern of these kind of things.
Wow.
And now his former students, they've built similar robots in Australia, throughout the US and elsewhere, to be able to get at the physics of this, or not the physics, yeah, I guess that is the right word, the physics of this, to understand how it fractures and how can we determine sort of what people in the past were doing to create these kind of patterns versus just a natural, the stone fell and broke. And so we have these very clear criteria, because in the end, science is about convincing your colleagues. If you want to convince your colleagues that this hypothesis is justified and should be a theory and should be true, a conclusion or something like that, you need to be able to demonstrate that beyond a shadow of the doubt. And that's not just, oh, that tool or that stone looks kind of interesting, so therefore it might be a tool.
Yep.
No, we have really clear criteria to understand natural versus human-made.
And there's the looks like thing again. I know we talked about this as well,
Yeah.
but I think it bears repeating for this, interview as well, where like looks like is not good enough evidence, full stop, for anything.
Yeah.
Like it looks like can be a start to something. You need to obviously identify things that look and don't look like. I'm not going to look at a stick and think it's an apt stone tool, because it's not, you know? But like if you just look at something and are like, it looks like, and really the evidence ends there, that's not good enough. Like I'm not trying to sound like, archaeological gatekeepy. Like that is just the fact, is like that is not enough evidence to prove anything. All that proves is that you think it looks like something. I feel that way, I think, exceptionally with the Bimini Road, where it's like you think a road this big.
That's the road that's underwater.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
This
the
big.
Hancock road,
Yeah,
right?
Well,
Like-
he didn't come up with it, but yeah.
He didn't come up
Okay.
with it, but
Yeah.
he's parroted it. Like, the only evidence is it looks like.
Do you know what that story is? It's hilarious. There was this guy in the 1930s, Edward Casey.
Yeah, I
who,
talked about this in
who
my
does
video. It's
clairvoyance,
insane.
and
Yep.
he believed that he was a reborn person from Atlantis.
Yep.
And he predicted that they would find Atlantis in this year, and in that year, after he's dead, 30 years later, some divers found that Bimini Road, and then they said, this is Atlantis. And his prediction came true. So that's literally where
Good
that
evidence
comes from.
right there.
It's just a piece of eroded beach rock.
The what it looks like argument for, in my world, I call this the isn't it weird?
Is it
Yeah,
weird?
there you
that's
go.
a-
And I always, and the answer
it weird
apparently
that-
is no, nothing is ever weird. Everything is always explained by whatever idea I guess there are no
Yeah.
coincidences. Nothing weird ever happens. Nothing strange ever happens. It's always explained by whatever controlling entity you think is in charge of everything. Just a quick question, because you brought this up before. It felt like 20 or 30 years ago, there was kind of this move from switching from BC and AD to BC and BCE, from before Christ and I don't know,
Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord.
versus like, and then it was like
CE
no, it
and
was
BCE.
CE, yeah, it was
CE
BCE
and
before
BCE.
Common Era and Common Era. Did we give up on that, or do you have feelings about it, or does it matter for anything?
I try and use it. I don't really.
Like
I'm sure
the
people.
CE,
Yeah.
BCE?
So like BC was,
Christ.
before Christ, and BCE and CE now is current era and before current era.
Yeah.
So it's just a little bit more interdenominational.
Screw
I
you,
suppose.
God.
Yeah.
I think
it's the woke mob essentially. Yeah.
Look, it's personal choice is what it ends
Yeah.
up being. Different people use it differently because they choose to do it in that way.
Yeah.
And I use it both ways. I've learned that with my public communication, I've just gone with BC and AD, because then if I don't, people troll me. They're
Yeah, I
like,
get that
oh my
shit all
God.
the
It's
time.
like, I really don't care. I really don't fucking care at all. It's just about denoting a date. And so it's just like,
Yeah, like,
whatever.
this is the hill you're dying on. Jesus.
Yeah.
You said that there's
Literally.
there's clear criteria for human made. What's the clear criteria?
Well, like I said, with the
User manual.
napstone tool, you end up with these sort of things. You have to create a striking platform first, and so that's going to be the flat bit that was hit. And then that's going to create these ripples, which creates this bulb. It just has to do with how this type of stone fractures. And so, for example, if you have an architectural block, you're going to see tool marks on it and stuff like that. And so, that's why people don't think Yonaguni is
That's
architecture under
the other Hancock thing
yeah,
in
underwater.
the tunnels that it shows
yeah.
Rogan, right?
And there's just, geologists have been there. They've found no evidence of tooling or or anything. And guess what? The island right above it has geologically the same features. So it's just part of geologically there. Yeah, it's how they fracture. And so, for everything, we have these kind of criteria to understand human versus not. It varies based on the material it's from. It varies based on, the period it's even from. But yeah, we have for sure these types of criteria.
That's a really frustrating thing when talking about these conspiracies, especially on things like, ancient apocalypses. Like, it can be up for debate as to whether or not any of the things are direct lies. And there probably are things that are direct lies, but a lot of it is just kind of a lie of omission. Like, yes, the Bimini Road can look like a road if you want it to be, but like, you are not giving people enough context by telling them that there is other beach rock that looks exactly like it, that is composed exactly like it, that is all around it. Like, you are omitting the like major pieces of the puzzle. And in doing that, it is deceiving an audience. It is at the very least deceptive. And it's really frustrating because so many people are really interested in it. And like, we've talked about this a lot. We talked about this here, where like the reason people are watching shows like that and are getting so into pseudo-archaeology is because people love archaeology. It's really interesting. I mean, name a kid that didn't grow up watching Indiana Jones and, we're inspired by it. I mean, we're practically sitting with them right now, Yeah. And so, at least his hat, And so I think that having that, inspiration is really great because it draws people in, but then they are being, whether it's malicious or not, they are being deceived by just not being provided with enough information to make these conclusions on their own, Yeah,
sometimes I think in one of our talks we brought this up that somebody will bring something up and it's like, this is really strange. I think I used a 9/11 example where there's like, can you imagine?
That was with me.
Yeah, like building, is it building 7 is what they say? Yeah, how, like, could you ever imagine a building being completely, on fire and for some reason, even though it's all still, it collapses? And like in my mind, I'm thinking like, no, I have no idea. I don't have a basis for comparison. How many buildings have you seen have suffered like that? Yeah, or like the towers, the way they fell. And it's like, I don't know. I've never seen commercial airliners.
How many buildings have you seen hit by a commercial airliner?
And sometimes there are things that you see that are really strange. And my first instinct, my trained instinct now, and I tell other people this, is when you see something that seems weird, your first thing should be like, how often does this happen? Like one of the things that was brought up was that they found passports of some of the hijackers from 9/11 just like out, in New York City. That sounds really bizarre to me.
Yeah.
It does. That sounds really weird. I'm like, the but then like I Google around, I'm like, how often does this happen? And apparently it's pretty common that in airplane crashes, like stuff inside the cabin, like paperwork and stuff can be dispersed, and you can find like whole documents that are basically untouched from like these catastrophic plane accidents. And I'm like, oh, that's really weird. I never would have expected that.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually the real key when you talk about this thing, like, is this a stone or a rock, right? Worked stone or not? We're developing these criteria based on millions of them. It's not based off of like, we have 5 stones and we're trying to develop criteria.
Yeah.
We have millions of them. I myself have excavated thousands and thousands of these flint stone tools, and also thousands and thousands of non-tools that were rocks.
That's
right?
something I was thinking of this a lot when you were talking with Hancock, and he kept on being like, well, how much of the Sahara has been like underturned? And I'm like, I feel like the only way, like, I can understand if you don't understand how like statistics and science works,
sampling,
why that feels like a really potent argument. But the problem is like, it's like if you believe in something like IQ, for example, the question that people ask would never be, well, have you tested every single person's brain for G? And it's like, no, because once you've tested like 1,200 people, you have so many data points. Like if you have millions, like I don't think people get, if you have millions of data points, you like that is astronomical amounts of evidence for this thing, that to now unearth that theory as being incorrect takes even more millions of data points, which is why you have like meta-analyses and then super meta-analyses, which is why it's like, yeah, we haven't overturned all of the Sahara, but we still have millions of data points where it's like, if this lost civilization was going to occur, we would expect, if we're like looking at a graph of a bell curve, and the bell curve represents essentially hunter-gatherer tribes, and there's a lost civilization, there should be this out-group curve that's just like blowing up on the side because we have millions and millions of data points.
People did the same thing with polling data. People say like, you only poll like 1,000 people. That's a lot of people for a poll. That's a good survey. Like, what do you assuming it's cross-sectional or whatever, right? That's you only need that much to have like your highest confidence intervals. Like the difference between like 1,000 and like 10,000 or even 1,000,000, it's not that much greater. A huge difference between like 10 and 100, and there's a pretty big difference between 100 and 1,000. But like past that, you're pretty
and
good.
Also, it's worth noting what the thing is that they're arguing for, which is a lost, advanced, globe-spanning civilization. This isn't the kind of thing where it's like, oh well, it's not over there. Like maybe it's over here. Maybe it's under this. Like. If you don't find globe-spanning evidence of the civilization you are talking about, it probably isn't there. I am sure. I made a video on the Green Sahara recently. It's absolutely fascinating. There is some incredible archaeology coming out of there, and as far as parts of the world go, it is pretty underrepresented. It hasn't been excavated as much as, Rome or Greece and stuff like that. So, like, there are going to be some immense archaeological discoveries to come out of there. And, like, that's not pseudo-archaeology. That's just, like, it hasn't been researched. So anything that comes out will be new, But, like, is that where the globe-spanning civilization was? Why didn't they leave anything everywhere else? Then I guess they're not globe spanning at the very least, So it's like, again, it's kind of looking over and over and over again and not admitting that it is not there ever. Like it's the thing with the keys is like, until I find my keys, I'm going to keep looking for them. And once I've found them, I've found them. But like, if you never find your keys, then like, I guess truly is lost,
And I mean, what I always get when I talk to the public is people really just don't understand how much archaeology there is and how much is done all the time. They like, if you watch archaeology on TV or YouTube, it's pretty much the same sites, the same kind of artifacts that get referenced, and it ignores all of what we actually do. Nobody's heard of Nicoria. A beautiful site, though. A lot of cool stuff.
This?
That's this. And so, nobody's heard of most of the projects I work on. I normally reference things like Pompeii or Athens or whatever because people recognize them. They stick in their heads. But most of the projects I've worked on are sites you've never heard of.
And the best example for conspiracy debunking for that are the moon landings, because people think that there was like 5 minutes of footage. There wasn't. There was hours and hours of really boring people hopping around without a single no evidence of being recorded on film. Yeah, it wasn't just like 5 minutes of stuff. And yeah, a lot of people don't realize that. It's like, it's not just like 2 or 3 of these things happen per year that are prone to error. I think this is what I mentioned before, is sometimes people will make a claim and they don't understand the magnitude of the claim that they're making. When you say that this thing is fake, you're saying that every government, every academic institution, every private corporation, and every citizenry that are involved in this project, you're implicating thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of people in this particular thing that everybody's managed to keep under. And for what?
And same thing with archaeology. We have hundreds of thousands of archaeologists in every single country around the world. Many of them working for governments, many of them working for private firms, many of them working for universities and nonprofits.
A lot of who, by the way, I bet would love to be able to say, I found this thing and you were wrong about it.
Which is what you do. We're always overturning history.
That's how I opened my thing on Ancient Apocalypse. I was like, if we had evidence of Atlantis, there's no archaeologist in the world who wouldn't want to have their name on that. You
should I keep this a secret and work with the other 1 million people, or should I be the guy?
No, I'm taking the guy. I am grabbing the golden idol. Like, absolutely.
They're going to call this mother Stephenopolis by the time I'm done talking about it. Right? Yeah.
It's even interesting to think about. It's like think about how if you tell your friend a secret, what's the chance that stays a secret in like your small friend group? First of all, if they're fucking somebody, 0% is a secret because that person knows 100%. And if that person knows, his best friend knows, right? And it's like, if you can't keep like who Paulina slept with last week a secret, why do you think Atlantis would be kept a secret?
Totally.
Like it's wild. You know what I love showing off? Like how little kids are like, look at my macaroni drawing. It's like, imagine your macaroni drawing is the Atlantis discovery. Like nobody's keeping that a secret.
And
that's exciting.
And again, like it would be if there was a long lost globe-spanning civilization, it would have had such a profound effect on the way that the world is. It would be a cornerstone in the way that the world developed. And I get that that's like, kind of the thing they're looking at of trying to be like, oh, well, these people have similar folk tales and storytelling and like, these stones are the same shape and stuff like that. So like, I get that's what they're looking for, but like, that's piss poor evidence. Like, there's going to be more evidence than that. They didn't just leave behind one big road in the Bahamas. Like, there'd be massive constructions left over. There'd be at least something. I don't even know if it's massive constructions, but like, and really the thing I want to highlight here for all of this and for, people watching is in the debate that you did with Graham Hancock on Joe Rogan, he admitted that there is no evidence for it.
Yeah, very
he literally, the words came out of Graham Hancock's mouth.
He did recently again as well. He finally gave one of his first public addresses since then.
Oh my God.
He doesn't address the debate or anything. He still is silent, by the way, because he knows he lost. but he actually said, "Look, I am not talking about material technology.
Yeah,
I
walking it
recognize
back.
there's
Yeah,
no material technology here."
Yeah,
And it's
I
just
heard him
like,
walking it back in the middle of things. Like, well, they were like really obsessed with the stars.
Yeah. And
they were really good at making
Ideas about the
maps.
star- And I was like, yeah, all the things that can't be tracked very well.
Yeah.
Or
Exactly.
not actually, and I would even argue against that. These are things that probably can be tracked pretty well because these ideas pass from civilization to civilization, right? Like the idea that we have of like democracy and republics, from Greece and Rome, or the idea of tracking the stars or mapping out the planet. Like these are technologies and things that move
And we
from
know-
civilization to civilization, right?
And we know that different civilizations define constellations differently.
Yeah.
And
They
this
drew
is-
them differently. They labeled them differently. All this kind of stuff. And so, like, it's one of the things that I find is there's what I call this universe of pseudo archaeology, where whether
it's
it's
like a
ancient
canon,
aliens or whether it's aliens, lizard people, Tartaria, or Atlantis, they all go to the same like 30 sites. And they're like, these are the 30 sites that prove aliens. And these are the same 30 sites, but they prove Atlantis. And it's just like, man, this is just so disingenuous.
Yeah, it
here.
is.
Like,
It's lame.
what's their catnip is just big stones. Is really what it is. Anytime there's a big stone, it's like, that's aliens or Atlantis or whatever. And it's like, or maybe it's just a really big stone.
Yeah. And the one that really gets me is a pretty foundational part of, Hancock's theory is talking about like Antarctica as part of it. And like,
Or it used to be, yeah.
Or used to be,
Yeah, he
yeah.
doesn't
I
do
know
that
he's kind of
anymore.
moved away from that a little bit, but he at least talks about mapping it now. And he
Yeah.
talks about like, he used the like Piri Reis map or the whatever, or Ignatius Phineas map, whichever one it is. He used one of those maps being like, this shows the outline of Australia, or of Australia, that's telling. It shows the outline of, Antarctica, and like, there's no like, no ice on it. Like it's ice free and stuff like that. And that's where I am proud to bring in, almost 9 years of environmental science experience, because that's just straight bullshit. Like that's not even like interpreting like a road or a rock that looks like a road and we can, talk day and night about it and we have to talk geology. It's like Antarctica was not ice free anytime in the last 2 million years. It just wasn't. It was not ice free. Like we have evidence of that. We would know there'd be so much, sea levels would be so much higher if there was ever a point where there was no ice on Antarctica. Like we have ice cores that go deep 2 million years or more. Like, so, these things, like it is
Give us
hinged
50
on things.
years. We're working on it, okay? We'll be ice free soon enough.
We're working
right?
on it. Yeah, exactly. We're enjoy those 2 million year ice cores while you
yeah.
still can. So this is a thing where like theories like this rely on just sort of saying a thing that just isn't true and then adding a bunch of other evidence that isn't true. But like the whole, like it's a house of cards. Like any one part of it isn't right. Like the hypothesis we could talk about, like there's nothing I'd love more than to sit with some of my friends and smoke a joint and talk about like, hey, what if there was a lost advanced civilization? That's kind of fun. And you spitball some ideas of like, where would they be? What would they do? What would they be like? And then, you sober up and you wake up the next day and go to work and welcome back to the real world, But like, there is no evidence. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. It came out of his own mouth. Like, that's crazy.
It's interesting to kind of look at, because maybe I'm super like being too charitable here now, and so let me know, but it makes me, when I like listen to the way, so my father-in-law's a flat earther, like staunch flat earther.
Wow.
Oh yeah, so our favorite gift to give him is a gyroscope. We give him a new one every year. Just like, and he loves it.
That's
by the
really
way.
funny.
Yeah,
I like that.
He's
That's
very
sweet.
good. He's very
Good
very
sport.
good natured about it.
That's sweet.
But one thing that's really interesting when I like listen to and talk to people that are very conspiracy brain specifically is it makes me like understand, especially when you look at like ancient civilizations and like myth creation, of like how that emerges out of the brain, like how people are able to kind of like create these complex, interesting, like kind of wild stories, which like maybe I'm just like carrying one and people like, shut up, Kyla, like you're just trying to make conspiracy theorists sound like noble and cute. But it's very interesting to me to listen to them and see like how they're able to take a couple of like half-truths and a couple of like things that are hard to like gyroscopes are weird. It's crazy. It's great. You hold this thing, it just always stays level no matter like where you put it in the air. That's cool. And how they like craft this narrative around it. That doesn't really make any sense. But then when you look at like all these ancient stories of like a bird dropping a whale in the ocean, you're like, I actually get how people are creating these myths.
Yeah.
So, but one thing I want to emphasize though is they're not always creating these myths.
Fair, okay,
These
there is
myths have such a
disinformation.
history
Yeah,
to
yeah.
them. If you go read Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis book, and then you go read Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods, you're gonna see immediately how one is derivative of the other. And if you go read Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis book and then read from a few hundred years earlier Francis Bacon's The New Atlantis, which is fiction, by the way, you can see the immediate parallels there. And then you go and you read Plato's Atlantis, and it doesn't look anything like any of those. Like, there's no survivors in Plato's Atlantis that taught people technology. That comes from Francis Bacon's fiction, right? Which then gets eventually transferred to nonfiction. Well, conspiracy nonfiction, pseudo-fiction, or pseudo-nonfiction, but pseudo-archaeology. But you can actually trace these histories of ideas. And what's really interesting is how they keep adapting with new technology and new concepts of history and stuff like that, where, you know, while Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods is obviously just an adaptation of Ignatius Donnelly's, Ignatius Donnelly was writing in a time period where they had no concept of the Ice Age. It was just a pre-flood culture. So it's still a pre-flood culture, but it's now set in the Ice Age because we understand when the Ice Age was. And it incorporates some newer sites, but it still incorporates a lot of the exact same evidence that was used 130 years earlier, right?
Not
Maybe
to start a religious debate, but it's the theory of like the God of the gaps, where it's like, well, I can see all of this, and I know that all of this is explained by my theory. And then as you have more and more discoveries, you kind of slowly have to whittle away at like the particular area that it occupies in order to make it adaptable. But again, it's because what was said earlier, like the conclusion is always the conclusion and it never changes, and you just find a new way to try to slot it into whatever your current understanding is.
It's like constantly moving the goalposts is like the way that it operates. And that's why like now we're at a point where it's just like, you know, vicious attacks against archaeologists on them not doing enough digging. Because it's like, you've already lost. Like, there is no evidence. If you are actually trying to claim that this is a scientific theory, that you are trying to play the game of science, then by your own principle, you have not proven it. It is not proven. In fact, there is a substantial evidence against it. And so what are you going to do now? Are you going to just keep being like, well, no, look over there? Or like, you guys are hiding it. It's like, no, like the conversation is done. We don't have evidence for this. You know? And maybe, you know, there's space to like, if a discovery was made in the future that like did lend credence to it, then you reopen that file again. But right now there's no evidence for it. Like, and there should be extensive, I cannot emphasize that enough, how much evidence there should be for this. Like, this is something huge. This isn't being like, I bet you that there is a civilization in the Sahara that we haven't discovered yet. And it's like, yeah, I mean, there probably is. And maybe I could get more specific with it. Maybe like it covered the whole of the Green Sahara at one time. Or maybe it was like, you know, on some river valley that isn't there anymore. And like, I could say that. And then if we searched that area and didn't find it, it wouldn't be there. But like, this is the whole world, or at least most of it. Where is it? Where is it? We have evidence of like these tiny cultures that are like practically like, you know, they're like a little sliver, especially in Europe, where it's like, you know, oh, great, the Pomeranian face urn culture. And what we know about them is they liked making urns with faces on them. And like, there you go. Like, we know about them. Why don't we know about the guys that conquered the whole world? That's just crazy.
Hence the God of the gaps.
Hence the God of the gaps.
I just have this stupid image in my mind of these stupid Pomeranian dogs running around like trying to make pods.
I saw one of those walking in here today. Jesus, little bastard.
And this all survives, though, of course, because they can create this idea that stigmatized knowledge.
Yes.
Right? And so, like, you know, it's one of the things is for some of these people that promote this kind of pseudo-archaeology, you can actually spot their lies very easily. Like, they are just making shit up. There's some people that like analyze these stone vases and they say they're so perfect, right?
Yeah, it couldn't be done without modern technology.
And then it's like, well, you look at the photo of it and like the handles are wonky, but you're just measuring one thing that you're claiming is perfect. Or you look at the photo and it's going inside and you can see the hand drill marks still on the inside surface, right? And so it's like, that's just total bullshit. But other people, on the other hand, they're so consistent in what they say. And I'd say Graham Hancock is one of these, where much of what he says, you really can't. I could see that he actually believes this because he's so consistent in it, except when he talks about what archaeologists do. So he has this one thing that he always says where it's like, archaeologists, when they dig in the Americas, they always stop at the Clovis layer because they assume there's nothing below it. And it's like, dude, you don't know. You're clearly just lying here. Most of our Clovis points are found on the surface. Are you saying we don't dig below the surface?
It's not like the Earth just slowly like develops an even layer of soil across it. Like,
we also have multiple Clovis layers on a site that has Clovis, right?
Oh my God.
And so we don't just assume there's nothing below when we find one Clovis point, because there could be more Clovis points below it in the layers below. And plus, most of our sites don't even have Clovis on it, right? So we just dig down to bedrock or sterile soil is what we do. And it's just like, that's just a lie to present this idea that we're hiding stuff, or we're unaccepting of we have these blinkers on, when in fact we dig down to bedrock, where we can't dig any lower.
Right.
Well, there
That's
are
what
glitches.
we do.
Never mind.
No, but that's why.
I was gonna make
What
a
about the
Minecraft-
subterranean
I
mole
was going to make a
people?
Minecraft joke. There is a glitch to get through bedrock.
And dude, I've worked on projects where you test that bedrock, especially in cave sites. You need to test whether that's cave collapse or whether that's bedrock, because these rock shelters in caves will collapse. And so you get out a jackhammer and you test it. Right?
Jesus.
And
This is what you do.
Do you know what's bedrock? Because basically it's like so hard you can't really penetrate
Yeah.
much deeper. Is that like the issue? So like even like diamond tipped can't really like
Well, no,
punch
you can get through it, like I said, with a jackhammer or something like
Okay,
that.
okay,
But
yeah.
There
They
would be any
wouldn't have
cultural
those
layers.
tools.
And to be
beneath it,
honest,
yeah.
usually you have very sterile layers before you hit bedrock anyway.
Oh, okay,
You know,
yeah. So like there's a
le-
queue of like there's just less and less to be found until you hit like this like
Nothing
blank
in it.
The
space.
nothing layer,
And
yeah.
you even test that. You get students to, it's a shitty job, to excavate sterile layers to make sure there's nothing below that. Like,
Just
we
looking at
actually
dirt
are
for
very
weeks.
obsessive about testing this, because we know that sometimes there's sterile layers, that below it there's cultural stuff. So we actually test that. We know that in caves sometimes there's cave collapse. So we test that. Like, it's just a lie.
Do sterile layers have even like plant matter or anything
Sometimes,
like that?
yeah.
Okay,
By
okay.
sterile, we mean they don't have any human
stuff.
stuff.
No human stuff,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Do you have a feeling in general when it comes to like kind of pop science and everything, and then even when it comes to like people that work in fields, do you have any feelings about generalists versus specialists?
I don't know what you mean exactly.
Somebody who highly special. So one of the big criticisms of a lot of pop science is that the people that write are often generalists, and that it's like their writings will be very multidisciplinary, where they're drawing from a ton of different fields. And then sometimes specialists will come into the woodworks and they'll say, well, you got this wrong, and you got this wrong, and you got this wrong. And a lot of specialists might be disagreeing. And I've heard some people say that people that write on a generalized level of things oftentimes are missing a lot of the details that like a specialist might. That isn't a thing that I guess it comes up, or have strong feelings about.
Oh, I have strong feelings.
Yeah, I got feelings about that too.
You
Flint,
can
I'll
go
let
first.
you. Okay,
yeah, if you want, I can. Well, you tell me.
Hit it.
Okay, so look, I think that generalist writing for the public can be a good thing, but oftentimes generalists writing for the public somehow think that they actually have an independent conclusion. So like with archaeology, you could think about somebody like Jared Diamond, right? Where he's written these really popular books. He ain't an archaeologist at all, and he just gets a lot of shit wrong.
Yeah, this is
And
what the
so-
guy had Gunstreams and Steel,
Yeah,
right? That's the
yeah.
guy that I mind, where a lot of
Or-
specialists have come out and criticized, like, okay, this is
It's
not-
completely wrong. His book Collapse as well. It just completely misrepresents the archaeological evidence, and it's just like, dude, this is a problem. If you're a generalist writing for the field, you should be trying to synthesize what experts have said. You shouldn't be trying to say, I know better than the experts. He's not a pseudoscientist because he's actually a real scientist. I think he's a geologist, but or a biologist. That's what it is. He's an ecologist. And so it's just like, but he is a pseudoscientist in the sense that he actually thinks he knows more about archaeology than archaeologists. Or another book is Sapiens. Yuval Noah Harari, I think his name is. Same sort of thing. He's writing at it from outside the field, and he's trying to put together this new picture of the past. And it's like, you don't understand the
history of
picture we
everything.
have.
Yeah.
Right? And so I am all for non-experts communicating what we have for the public, but they need to do so in a way that acknowledges, hey, experts are the ones that are creating this evidence and creating these narratives that I'm making understandable for the public, if you see what I mean. And that, I think, is extremely important as an expert, where I'm really sick and tired. This is why I started doing social media in the first place on Atlantis and pseudoscience. It's not just pseudoscientists that I'm sick and tired of. It's also like journalists, right, who just misrepresent what we say and what we do sometimes.
And I feel like some of the greatest harm comes even from scientists who, for whatever reason, think that they can step outside of their field and are like magically imbued with all the knowledge of another field.
Exactly. That's what some of these people are. And it's just like, this is a real problem here. And this is where I really advocate for more experts to speak up and try to learn how to write and speak in a way that's understandable so that we can actually say what we have in a fair way. Now, when I speak and write about archaeology, it's nowhere near as grandiose as these people, because our stuff is not so grandiose.
Yeah.
Our stuff is super interesting, but it's not grandiose. There isn't some super theory of everything, like that explains it. And when people start coming up with a super theory of everything, sorry guys, and go to a textbook instead, is what I'd say. Go read Renfrew and Bond Archaeology. That'll give you the big picture of archaeology in a nuanced way. It'll be a lot more boring, but it's going to be honest.
Can I ask you actually about Sapiens? Because that's actually a book I really, really enjoyed. Obviously now I'm a little, is there explicit like mis and disinformation in that, or like, and do you have a recommendation of similar topic but more accurate then? Just because I really liked the topic of sapiens, and now I'm sad to
I was the same way.
Now I'm
I
sad
brought it up
of
to
how
Flint and I
much-
was like, look,
We talked about
I
this
brought it
last
up as a
night.
great example of science communication. I've been reading it too. He's like, oh God, sapiens, that. I'm
I've
like,
actually
what?
not read it because
Yeah.
I've seen so many really terrible reviews of it, but it is universally panned in the archaeology community. I mean, like universally, there's a lot of reviews that experts have written, and it is just, it's not like, say, the Wenger and Graeber Dawn of Everything, which has some problems, but it's written in a phenomenal anthropological and archaeological way, and it
Dawn of everything. There you go.
yeah, Dawn of Everything. That's something interesting. But there's issues with that as well, especially when it gets down to the specific level.
Scratch that.
Which is why the problem is when you're trying to write the big picture,
Yeah.
you're going to make mistakes because, as we've been talking about, what archaeology really is very local and regional and specific in time place. It's actually where I think Graham Hancock gets something really right. He criticizes this idea of the sort of the progression of society, a linear progression. He's totally right to criticize
Yeah,
that. Almost
absolutely.
no archaeologist or historian believes in that anymore.
And so that's like a really big problem with Yuval is it feels
It's
exceptionally
very linear, like through all
Exactly.
places at all times. And that was the one thing that I kind of picked up on reading it. And I was like, I don't know, it's well written. The sites
well
are real,
written.
like, you know, places. And like, it's not like misinformation in the same way that, like, you know, Graham Hancock is. But like, it definitely, I was
like-
also kind of gathering. I'm going to read some reviews of it because I'm curious what people with more experience
Like
in the field have to
low-res.
say.
And a specific
Low
critique
res,
of
yeah.
some of these like linear progressions, you could think about human evolution, right? We think of evolution in a public way as a sort of step-by-step progression from one species to another until we're human, right? And that's how it's presented as this family tree. However, most people that study human evolution today, now that they've discovered so many more hominid species than they ever thought they would, and they realize now from DNA and stuff like that, they can see sort of mingling between different species. The analogy for it is no longer a tree that branches to an end point, which is us. Instead, it's a braided stream where you have these populations that separate for hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of years, but then they intermingle again. We know that with Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, for
Yeah.
example. We see that with Denisovans, for example. And so, you know, everybody has some Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. Pretty much everybody in the world. And so it's the same thing going back, you know, millions of years into the future with these different hominid species. They were geographically isolated for periods of time, but then they came back together. And so thinking of human evolution as this linear tree progression, it's totally flawed. But really, this new braided stream concept is fairly new. It's only in the last, 15 years with being able to do this ancient DNA that scholars that focus on human evolution recognize it. And so it's not reached the general public yet. I would say go pay attention to some stuff written by Chris Stringer. He's written really good stuff. He's the one who really popularized the out of Africa theory, and he updates his books regularly to make sure that they're up to date on the evolution of humanity in a sense. And so that's who I'd recommend to read.
I feel like a big problem with people that try to generalize things is when we look at things as humans, we want coherent, cohesive stories that follow certain structures.
Yes.
And reality is oftentimes just kind of more, I don't want to say boring, but there's just like a lot going on at all points in time. And when you're trying to write stuff that is summarizing like huge swaths of history, the biggest error I think that people commit, I don't know if this is more on the writer or the reader, I would probably lean in on the writer, is in an attempt to summarize things, they don't caveat carefully enough that like, this is a summary. And when you look at your current life and you ask any question about your current life, there's always a multitude of factors that influence everything. When I'm fighting in the red pill communities, when people talk about like divorce rates or whatever, and people will point to like, oh, well, like who initiates a divorce more? Like the question is, well, what does that even mean when you're asking that question? Like if, let's say that, like a wife initiates a divorce against a husband because the husband is hitting her. Is the wife the reason why the marriage ended? What if we found out the husband was hitting the wife because the husband found out the wife was like trying to abuse their children? Well, now is it the husband's fault? What if the wife abuses the children because there's like a multitude of reasons for why any particular thing happens, but sometimes, and this goes into the, I think it was with you, I spoke about like citation errors, where people will cite one sentence out of a book or whatever, and people have a really difficult time ascribing magnitude to a particular sentence they read, where if you say something like, this war happened because of like this factor, people are like, oh, that was it. It's like, well, no, there's probably a whole bunch of different things going on.
Reasons, yeah.
But then the issue is that and then this is the issue, that this is it's really good to create documentaries this way. It's really bad to write history this way. When you're looking at a multitude of events, you want to find like this through line of like, here's a really cool story I can tell about World War II. But if you just watch one person's journey through World War II, you're going to have all the biases and bad thoughts that they had that person had, right? But if you want to tell the totality of a story, what are you going to go over? Every vehicle, every death, every thought, every
Yeah,
like
you
it's
have to leave
impossible.
out something.
You have to leave out so much.
Yeah.
But when you're trying to write these like a documentary of all of human history, well, you probably have some idea in mind at the start of what you want it to look like. And now when you're picking and choosing facts going from time period to time period, you're probably going to be more like leaning into the things that you want to tell the story of. But then when somebody reads your work at the end, nobody sees like the film on the cutting room floor of the film that you've created of all of human history. And now in their mind, you're not giving me like, this is your story of human history. Now you've collapsed human history to their story.
Yeah,
It's like,
ironed
this
it
is
out,
everything.
yeah.
And people just don't, I feel like sometimes, and I would probably fault the writer more, the writer isn't explaining how much sometimes is being left on the floor and all the editorial decisions they've made. And now people are walk away thinking like, oh, well,
That was it. I know
this
all of
happened
it.
because of that, and this happened because of that, and and that's why we have to do this. And it's like, yeah.
I mean, it's why I said, look, if you're going to do public communication as a scientist or a scholar, your job is not to make things simple. Your job is to make them understandable. Because it's not simple, and you're being dishonest to the subject matter if you're oversimplifying. I mean, it's fine for children, right? You're trying to, especially like, you're teaching we do this in university level, the very intro archaeology course. You're just trying to give people a sort of big picture. And as they get more advanced in their courses, you're trying to make that complex, right? And so, but if you're going to be honest with the public, you have to show that complexity. You have to show that nuance. You have to show that it's not so simple, but it is still really interesting, and you need to make it understandable. And that's the challenge, I think, for everybody, for generalists and specialists even, is to represent things in a fair way, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I'm super curious. Do you know any of the leading theories? This is going to be like a simple archaeology question. You talked about like how there's a whole bunch of different species that kind of have ebbed and flowed and intermingled. Do you know the leading theory of why it's kind of just us now? Like do you know where the rest went? I imagine it's a heterogeneous answer depending on the species, but in general, like what's led to so many different collapses of species that we're kind of the only ones left as far as the Homo lineage?
Why are there so many Charizards and no Charmanders? That's the question, okay?
I mean, look, I think that it's a question of how we define us. In many ways, we all have Neanderthal DNA. We all have Denisovan DNA.
Also, that was linear progression, so no.
What do you mean?
Well, you said
no, that's one of the
Charizard and Charmander, as in like they're before us and we're after. But it's actually more like there's Charizard blue and Charizard red and Charizard purple and Charizard shiny.
Sure, yeah. But
I'm
one of the
trying to
common
figure out
arguments,
why Charizard red is the only one left right now.
Yeah, one of the common arguments for why evolution can be real. I don't know if religious people use this, but they talk about like the missing links.
Yeah.
Like why don't we have all of these different links between, or these?
Which
How
is
do
such
these
a
things
silly
disappear?
concept now. That's
Especially
with that
because we,
flawed
like,
tree
definitely-
concept, right?
Yeah.
And so we actually, that's the whole key, is we're now realizing that what being human is much more complicated. Because we all, and I mean everybody in the world, has Neanderthal lineage. Everybody in the world has Denisovan lineage, right?
Yeah,
and
but I
so
have more.
because of that, the Neanderthals have not disappeared. They're part of us, if you see what I mean.
Wow.
And so that then makes questions about the difference between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens far more complicated. We know that they are different populations of humans, but clearly Neanderthals were humans too, if you see what I mean. Very, very clearly they were. And so, there's a big debate over that very topic. And what's interesting is we've now found individuals that, it was only, like individuals from tens of thousands of years ago who had a Neanderthal grandparent and a Homo sapiens grandparent. That close to that intermingling, if you see what I mean. And so as we get more of this DNA from different ancestral populations, we'll be able to answer those questions more specifically. But there's different hypotheses over how Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, for example, came together, right? Was it violence, or was it just the fact that humans, by the time they met Neanderthals Neanderthals had different adaptations, which meant they had a larger population size, so that when they absorbed Neanderthals into their population, it was just
there's more
sapiens DNA in the population that resulted, if you see what I mean. And
Yep.
so there's a lot of people that work on modeling this. I don't know actually what the up-to-date stuff is, but every single time it's really tough to get DNA that is that old. DNA degrades. Even one of the sites I'm working on, I sent off 60 animal teeth to a lab to get DNA. Only one of them had DNA for replication.
Wow.
And that's only from 2,500 years ago. We're talking about remains from tens of thousands of years ago. And, DNA technology, by the way, is also, you have to be very careful with ancient DNA because the techniques and methods have changed drastically in the last 5-10 years. This sort of next generation sequencing is what it's called, where the way that they piece together ancient genomes is so different. They're using shorter strands, which means they can get more of it. It also means that they might get more incomplete pictures sometimes of it. And it also means that they can exclude sort of modern contamination because those are going to be longer, less degraded strands. And so with this next generation sequencing, everything we know about ancient DNA is in the process of being completely rewritten because it's also much cheaper, and we are being swarmed and swamped with new genomes to be able to tell the story of humanity, of different animals and plants and things like that as well.
That's where we'll find the lost civilization.
So there's another example of something that is actively changing that we've just kind of broken into the field of it and are we have not really hit the plateau yet because there is more technology being discovered that lets us do it even better. So instead of talking about it there's going to be some discovery that suddenly changes all of archaeology. It's no, there's things like this are going to be what change archaeology. Where there is now new technology that allows us to get more information from less pieces and things like that. That is genuinely going to make huge changes. It's not going to prove a lost advanced civilization, but stuff like this is happening, and it's really frustrating when a lot of the pseudo crowd they talk about these big changes so much that it almost muddies the waters so much that we can't even talk about these things that are really happening and really are going to make big changes in the archaeology world, because they breed this mentality that we are hidebound and we think that this is the way it always is going to be and it's never going to change and this is it, we figured it all out. No, nobody thinks that way, and these changes are exciting and they're happening right now. This is going to be a new golden age.
And just to give a sense of context of how important this change in DNA sequencing is it's not just for understanding human DNA and being able to go further back. It means we can look at, say, DNA from the dental calculus on animals and humans, and we can actually understand their oral microbiome to understand the kind of pathogens that they're infected with.
Wow.
So we're actually able, Johann Kraus and others are tracing the Yersinia pestis, so the Black Plague, back thousands of years.
Wow.
And being able to trace where that's going in prehistory from dental plaque, right? Or another big change is we're able to get DNA from sediment. Human DNA sometimes, but also plants and animals. And so you say, well, we should dig all of a site. Well, dude, then we'll never be able to test the DNA of that sediment in the future. And so, we're able to get a different picture of ecology, therefore, from DNA in the sediment, because we're getting sort of plant species that won't show up in the archaeological record and stuff like that. And it's really revolutionary. It's not just DNA, it's things like isotopes as well. This is what I do. I actually think isotopes are in many ways more interesting than DNA because nobody knows about them. They keep a record of sort of what you eat and what you drink. And so what that means is, and for animals too, and plants. And so what that means is you can see that since your teeth grow when you're a child, and you compare the isotopes in your teeth to the isotopes in your bones, you can see how somebody migrated because the geological signature from the groundwater is different. Or you can look at what they actually consume, the kind of food that they're eating, which shows up in the carbon and nitrogen isotope signatures. And what's really friggin' cool is if you sort of sample linearly on a tooth, mostly animals, but you can do it on incisors and canines for humans, you can actually, using oxygen isotopes, understand the season that sample comes from, like winter versus summer versus spring, and you can therefore understand, were people seasonally moving around? Were they eating different foods during different seasons, and how does that manifest itself? So the kind of resolution we have right now is just it's night and day different from, what we used to have. And so it's revolutionizing everything in that sense.
One of the videos that I did was on Rupkund Lake, which is a site in the Himalayas where they found all these skeletons in a lake. It's a super flashy site. Everyone always talks about it. It's super, grotesque and mysterious looking. And they did a bunch of, DNA analysis of it, trying to figure out like where these people are from. They ended up finding that it was like 2 or 3 different groups that died there at different times. And that was one of the things they were talking about. And it was doing the isotope sequencing and being able to tell not only where they were from based on DNA, but on the isotopes in their teeth because their diets were different. So they were able to tell that one group of these people came from like the Mediterranean because they had a bunch of like fish in their diet. And like they all ate different grains. And it's like, these are people in the middle of the Himalayan mountains. Like that's pretty far from the ocean, So like, it's really interesting to look at those things. And like, there's so much information you can get out of it. So like, I know we sound like a broken record with this, but like, that's why we don't excavate all these sites, because like, we didn't have this technology 5, 10, 20 years ago, and like at least not at the developed point that it is now. So like there's going to be continually better technology that will be able to tell us more and more. That's one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated by Otzi. I mentioned him yesterday. The reason I really got, like, he was the first thing that really got me into archaeology. And
that's the wet mummy.
That's the wet mummy, yes. So
the Iceman.
The Iceman. Otzi the Iceman. So the thing that is really amazing about him is because of how unbelievably well preserved he is, they can like piece together like the last like 48 plus hours of his life. Like really well.
Like what he ate,
what
where
he
went.
ate. And the one that really stands out to me, not only can they tell like all of the last meals that he ate, but they can tell that he climbed up and down the mountain like 2 or 3 times before dying because of the pollen clung to his clothes and like hair. Like they can look at this, they know he died in like the late spring because of the pollen that was out. Like they could tell so much. And this was a mummy that was discovered in the 90s. Like more has been done, but like, can you imagine if we found something like that now? Like I am sure we could have got even more information than we did. And granted, we are so lucky. He is amazingly well preserved. They did a wonderful job preserving the context and like getting all the artifacts to a safe location so we can continue to study them. But like, it's an absolutely fascinating, case study in being able to look at like one individual. We're not looking at a king. We're not looking at a leader. And I think that's really what stuck out to me about him is like, he was just a guy. There's a lot of theories that he was someone really important because he had a copper axe, which like copper would have been pretty hard to come by at that point. But like, we have no idea if he was important or not. Like he was a dude, he wore, some woven shoes, he had a quiver on his back and a bow and arrow and a hatchet. And like, he died in the mountains being shot in the back. We don't know anything about him. And like, but we can piece together like it's like a forensic case. Like it is literally a 5,000-year-old cold case of someone who was murdered. And you can look at like where he went, what he ate. You can piece together the last 48 hours of his life thanks to the scientific, research and capabilities we have at our disposal. It's amazing.
I think it also shows probably the importance of context too, because even questions like that could change where you find somebody's teeth and you think that maybe they migrated for a diet, but maybe you discover some other thing and you're like, oh, actually they were trading with people that were bringing food from this area too, so they didn't actually migrate. Yeah,
excellent.
So the context is important as well,
yeah.
Yeah, that actually happens a lot because we can do this on plants as well. So you can actually test the plants for the isotopes. Like if you have charred remains of wheat or something like that, they're importing that stuff, right? And so you can find that kind of that stuff very clearly. Yeah.
Again, really random question. How does like the field feel about like 23andMe and these type of like genealogy websites?
It's bullshit.
Yeah.
It's all bullshit for like lots of reasons. One of the key reasons is like, look at it. The scale of your ancestry is so, you have what? Half of the DNA of your parents, a quarter of your grandparents, an eighth of your great-grandparents, so on and so forth. Once you go back like 15 generations, you actually are missing the vast majority of the DNA signatures from each of your ancestors, if you see what I mean. And so they can't reconstruct that. It's actually, the human isopoint. So the isopoint is where you can tell that everybody in a population shares the same ancestors. You might have different inputs from different ancestors statistically, but everybody shares the exact same ancestors. So for Europeans, the isopoint is about 1,000 years ago, which means that every single person alive 1,000 years ago in Europe that has passed on DNA to today, every European has those exact same ancestors. The human isopoint for all of humanity is just a few thousand years ago. And so we all share the same ancestry. We are actually extremely closely related. And so these kind of DNA tests, they tell this very interesting fiction, if you see what I mean, that ignores all the diversity and interrelatedness because of all of our ancestral intermingling that has happened. And the other issue that I find with this kind of studies is they mostly take account of modern DNA. So what it is actually telling you is your DNA statistically is similar to modern people in Ireland. Not necessarily similar to ancient people in Ireland, if you see
That's what I was going to say, because I was going to say, and I'd have to read them more particularly because I've never done one of these before, but I don't know if I would say that it's bullshit or they're bad. It's just understanding it's understanding what exactly they're telling you, which is all they're doing when they do these things. I feel like they say it on but maybe they don't. All they're doing when they do these things is your DNA, based on the sample that we did, seems like it matches people that are also testing from like this area.
Exactly.
And that's it. That's the extent.
But people interpret that as
2 million years
something
ago.
else,
My Irish ancestors.
Exactly.
Sure.
And when in fact that's not the friggin' case at all, because if you look at the archaeology of Ireland, you can see changes in population structure over time. The Irish population was not the same, if you see what I mean. There's new people coming, there's other people dying, there's who chooses to reproduce and leave, there's all this kind of stuff that goes in there. And the reality, the history of humanity is one of just intermingling in the end.
Yeah, I think from just from a mere interest perspective, I did an ancestry thing a little while ago because I was curious, because I know my dad's ancestry very well, but my mom was adopted and we don't know very much about where her parents were from. So I was like, okay, I'll be able to I know what my dad is, so I can look at the other half and at least figure out where her parents were from. So I know my dad is fully Italian, so I was like, whatever the other 50% is will probably be that. Well, it turns out I'm 80% Italian, so I was like, okay, that's pretty safe to assume one of her parents was probably also fully Italian, and there's a little bit of Greek, a little bit of Polish, a little bit of something else sprinkled in there. But that was kind of interesting to be able to get that. And then, extrapolating that out to kind of what you're talking about, that is modern, semi-modern Italian, people who live there now. Probably a very small part of that data or that DNA goes back to Romans, because Italy was people came into it after the collapse of the Roman Empire. There was Germanic speaking people that came in, and people came from Greece and this and that and the other. So my DNA lines up very well with modern populations in central southern Italy. And that is probably where for the last 300-400 years my ancestors were, but that doesn't mean that my ancestors were Roman gladiators or something as cool as that would be. So
I do politics here. Hold on, so because I can't let you get away with that, because you showed us your 23andMe yesterday. That 50% we saw was 100 miles off the west coast of the United States, actually, for so much of it. It's interesting that now you're denying your Atlantean heritage. But
I'm falsifying the evidence here, man. Sure. I'm a scientist. That's what I do.
So if you take a 23andMe and it says you're 80% from France or anything like that, it's probably reasonable to assume that the last 4 generations of you probably immigrated from France or was from France, but it's probably not much deeper than 70 to 80 years back in your family history, or 120 years. It's not going much deeper than that, if that.
And there's obviously confusing signatures there as well, because not everybody in France has the same DNA, right? And so it's sort of what it means is you're 80% similar to people in France today. But potentially it's the case where your ancestor actually came from Italy, but they had similar DNA to somebody from France, if you see what I mean. And so, because that's the kind of stuff that it can't detect, is it's homogenizing what is actually a fairly heterogeneous group. It's sort of saying this is French DNA, but of course people living in Italy or Russia had some French DNA. They're just the exception to the rule in that area, if you see what I mean. And so that's where it becomes tricky.
Right, it's comparing you to an aggregate, essentially.
And so it just means you are similar, closely related to people in France now, on average, who's in France now. Yeah.
Gotcha.
You guys, do you have any other questions or anything?
Oh.
No, I'm good. Yeah, shout out your socials.
We had a question for you that we came up with.
Oh, yes, we do.
Okay. T-Rex. That's my favorite dinosaur.
That's such an exceptionally dinosaur to pick.
Look, a lot of what we've been talking about is between yesterday's interviews and today is sort of this issue of pseudoscience and pseudo-archaeology and conspiracism and stuff like that. You guys have your finger on the pulse of modern culture in a very different way than we do. Why do you guys see this as becoming so much more popular and prevalent right now?
I think there are a lot of different issues at play. I think one of the largest issues is that our lives have become so unbelievably complicated that the further you're divorced from a process, the easier it is to kind of slide in conspiratorial thinking into what's going on. Nobody would ever wonder if their abacus is tracking their daily movements or is showing them ads based on what they've said, but nobody knows how a phone works. So it's a lot easier to insert, conspiratorial thinking there when you just don't know the process. There are a lot of people who, they might imagine the way that a police investigation or the FDA approves something or whatever, where they just don't know any of the process. And if you don't know it, and then if somebody else is willing to feed you a particular conspiracy, and when that conspiracy makes the world really easy to understand, like very clear, very easy, it's us and then them, and them 95% of the time is the Jews, but there's some other guy that's pulling the strings. It organizes society in a very easy to understand way. It gives me one thing to be upset about. Oftentimes a thing that is totally out of my control, so I don't even really have to worry about it or take any actions against it. I remember the only time I've ever heard or gotten Alex Jones to shut up his entire life is when we were in Austin at some event, and after he did his whole ramble about how the elections are rigged and the media is rigged and everything, I think I asked, what do you want your audience to do about this? And it was like a good 5-second silence where it's because there's what the fuck are you even selling people? There's nothing that you can do about
just
it.
Getting people mad.
Yeah, there's literally no, because why even fight against anything? And that's my tweets now is I'm basically saying man, I think all the conservatives should protest the election and just not vote, because what's the point? They're going to rig it anyway, right? Just stay home, right? Yeah, I think that is that concept of not understanding how anything works. So it's easy to insert conspiracies, and then it's that the world has become so complicated. And we've solved, to be fair, and I know there are different people for different reasons, don't want to take credit for things, we've solved a lot of really simple problems. We've solved a lot of the simple sexism and the simple racism in the United States. And the way that it manifests now is a lot more difficult to wrap your hands around. Lynching is obviously bad. Policing a neighborhood more that might have a demographic that's more prevalent in it, that is doing drugs that should or shouldn't be illegal, and this is a lot more challenging of a question to answer, right? Lynching is indefensible, basically, on its own. You can't. These other things require a lot more attention to detail. So you can't be an expert in everything. The media has failed us. Alternative media, especially, by the way, has failed us tremendously. And and people want simple answers and simple ways to understand the world.
What do you mean by alternative media?
Alternative media is garbage, because it's taken the worst parts of mainstream media and it has made that the entirety of what it does. Every accusation that these guys are biased and they don't tell both sides of the story. Alternative media does it a million times worse.
Gotcha. Yeah, I see what you mean.
And alternative media, for all of its faults, at least has one thing that's a little bit more important that alternative media lacks, and that's accountability. Lack of accountability and no accountability mechanisms in alternative media means you can just lie about everything, and it never really comes back to bite you. Whereas mainstream media, even Fox News, got hit with that massive Dominion lawsuit, or when they mess up, people get mad and people are fired, right? Tim Pool is never getting fired from the Tim Pool show. Dave Rubin is never getting fired from the Dave Rubin show. Tucker Carlson can get fired from Fox News. That's an important distinction, I think. But there's 15 other things that also play into it. But I would say, broadly speaking, it's complexity of society, complexity of the problems. People want a simple narrative, and there's a lot of money to be made selling you that simple narrative for things that people don't understand.
That's a really good response. And it's that, we talked about the hasty generalization fallacy yesterday, where it's you don't want things to be complicated. I just want to be able to understand it. It's too much to think about how complex archaeology is and how complex every culture at every time has ever been. So it's easier to just be there was one big one and all the major ones came from that one big one, and I can digest that. I don't need to have, an understanding of bone, history from ancient Greece in order to know how to digest that. I can just be told that and I'm I get it now. Cool. And then I can go on with my day. It's so much easier to, look at, the media is lying to you than it is to have to think about every single thing they're saying and look at the sources for it and look at the evidence for it. Just be the archaeologists are lying and they're all in cahoots to keep you in the dark. And it's okay, cool. Now I don't have to look critically at anything.
I wish that there's so much now that's worn as an aesthetic, because people are envious of the normativity of the function of the aesthetic. So somebody will talk about truth or logic or reason. Okay. Now the function of these things ideally is to deliver some true statement that you can then utilize in some way to improve your life, right? You have science, and discoveries from science lead to technology, and technology improves our lives, ideally, right? Or helps us kill each other better, depending on what side of the technology you're on, right? It improves the lives of the people shooting the other people, right?
For whoever's left.
Yeah, so for truth and logic and reason, okay, that function yields a desirable aesthetic. I want to be seen as somebody that's truthful because truth delivers these things. But the problem is so many people wield just the aesthetic with none of the functionality so that they can have all of the normativity, all the goodness of that. That's why, it's so funny today. If somebody has truth or logic or reason as like the channel title, you know, these are always the number one purveyors of bullshit pseudo information. Project Veritas. Doesn't Veritas mean truth in
Yes,
like
it does in Latin.
Yeah, or in Latin. Yeah, it's always the number one purveyors of misinformation. And there are so many people who, and I wish that it was so easy to see through. Like Candace Owens, people will come out and they'll say things like, you know, I've been really curious about, you know, 6 million. And I'm like, let's assume that you are. Why have you been curious about this for 3 years? Pick up a fucking book. You know, other people have had these questions. Like, this isn't
Don't
an
you have
empty,
other shit
unstudied
to
field.
do?
Yeah. Never in my life has a person come to me and they're like, I'm really curious about XYZ conspiracy, and here's the 3 or 4 different books I've read on the subject, and here are the questions. It's never that. It's like, here's the 2 or 3 tweets I've read. Why not? If you're actually curious, why not go read about it?
Look into it
do
and see that
anything.
you're
Do any
wrong.
kind of research.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's frustrating. It's just it's an aesthetic. Like, oh, I'm curious about this thing, jacking off, right? Just asking questions,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Go do some homework then. It's your job.
Yeah, and that's the thing is like it's so harmful. Like it really is, and like they're able to veil it under this guise of the just asking questions thing. So it allows you to just get away with anything. Like you don't have to say that thing about, you know, the 6 million. You just have to like ask the question, and it's like whoa. Well, I'm not saying that. Like that would be a complete overstep. But like I'm just putting it out there, and then you go to the comments, and it's like swastika.
And that's the problem, is this plausible deniability.
It is.
It's saying I'm not a
absolutely.
liar because I'm just asking a question. And
I'm
it's
just
like,
joking,
but the way you
right?
phrased it, you fucking said it, dude.
Yeah,
and the worst thing too is what you said about what Flint said about technology improving and there being exciting things. One of the saddest things I found is that we can't be excited about or take credit for anything anymore. Even things that like we should have a lot of pride over. You talked about how DNA is difficult to study. RNA dissolves if you look at it. It's a like tenaciously like unstable molecule, like everything related to it. The idea that we found a way to encapsulate this and these like lipid nanoparticles and inject this into a body to deliver like things for like vaccines. This is a really cool invention.
Huge.
It's cool because it involves a lot of general research. It's like 3 decades of research that's been like highly commercialized by like a capitalist entity that was highly globalized and worked across different like countries. BioNTech was a German company. And, like, this is a really cool, like this is a human mankind achievement, a uniquely human mankind, a uniquely globalist one, a uniquely capitalist one. All things that America, you know, kind of stands for. And nobody can take credit for that ever, because now it's all like every single new discovery and every single new thing is just
they're lying. It's all part of the cover up
infected with conspiratorial nonsense, and it's like yeah,
because it's hard to understand. It goes back to that thing you said earlier, where it's like I don't know how vaccines, like I know how vaccines work, but like I couldn't make a vaccine. If you put me in a room with all the things you need to make a vaccine, I couldn't make one. I couldn't tell you the real like science behind it, but like I trust there's a lot of people involved in it who know what they're doing. But like, because I don't know how to do it, because I don't have my hands on every part of it, it's like the abacus. I can do math on an abacus, but on my phone it's a little bit more complicated. I don't know the fundamental ins and outs of it, and because of that, humans can be really distrusting. And so that just gives any ground. And the reason we can't take credit for anything today is because everything we do is now at that level of complexity. You look at a plane in the sky and it's chemtrails, and it's like, man, that's condensation. It's a giant engine. Like, are you kidding me? And like, it's really hard to be able to rationalize those things. And so it's a lot easier to like, if you tried to sit down and explain to someone why there's like, you know, condensation behind a plane, like that's going to take a lot longer than me saying like, it's chemtrails and the Jews, by the way.
And by the time you've explained that, the person that's arguing on the other end has the next conspiracy theory lined up.
Completely. Yeah. Like you've already lost once you start wasting your breath.
I think the biggest problem is this breakdown in trust, right? You know, like all of science is built upon trust. The only way to advance in science is to trust what your colleagues are publishing. And obviously we find examples of bad actors that have created forgeries or have misrepresented data and stuff like that. But that's like such a tiny subset of what scholars do. In the end, the only way we can advance is I have to trust your reporting of that excavation or of that experiment or of whatever your observations are. That's the only way. Yes, I can then test that to make sure that it's replicable in a sense. I could go and re-excavate the part of the site you didn't activate. I could go study that material. I could check what your photos are and what your data is. But at the same time, everything is built upon trust. And this entire new movement is built upon breaking down that trust.
A little bit. I used to say that, but I think it's more malicious, unfortunately. And I notice this when I argue with people, it's not a breakdown of trust. It's a selective application of trust in the furtherance of a particular narrative. Because if I'm arguing with somebody about foreign policy and I cite something from, like the CIA or the U.S. State Department, I'm immediately called a shill, and they'll argue against me posting links from Russia Today. I'm like, what do you mean?
So you trust them, but not.
Why the f- are you trusting this but not this, right? And it's and I think that the major fault right now lies with probably some mainstream, but a lot of alternative media creators.
Yeah.
Like in talking to Jordan Peterson, like him saying like, well, 20% excess deaths Europe, the vaccines. And it's like, how could you even like suggest that without that? Such a tremendous claim. Or talking about like theirs, and it's like this. You were like I don't know if he got a doctor like physician, but I know at the very least he's like a
clinical
PhD.
psychologist.
Okay, but like, how do you not know anything about the VAERS database? And you're sitting here talking to me about like it's a vaccine adverse events database. It doesn't prove. Yeah, and it's like there have been a lot more reports over the history of whatever. But none of those are. It doesn't mean it was caused by a vaccine. It just means that when a bad event happens afterwards, like a thing, you report it to a doctor. And if you give 1 million people a thing, 100 people are going to die, probably just statistically afterwards. Like this is all like more investigation after. Yeah. But like, these people in alternative media who are to some extent respectable figures because they've got PhDs or some other type of qualifications or credentials, are just like leading people down these insanely conspiratorial roads. And then people will say that thing like, well, I don't really trust our institutions. Why the do you trust Tim Pool or Jordan Peterson? Yeah. You realize these guys are making money directly, like hand over fist, telling you exactly what they're telling you and want to hear. Why would you not trust? Also, no, not to knock anybody that works in public service. I'm not knocking anybody, okay? Like people in my position and in these positions make a lot of money, okay? These guys that work for government, this dude makes like $55,000 a year.
Scholars, scientists, like, etc.
They're not financially
incentivized. If I tell you the right lie, that might be like $1 million difference in income this year. If this guy tells you a lie, what? He's going to get shit canned from his $55,000 a year job. Like, what? Where is his compensation for this? And
where's the coordination in that? Like, you hear all the the COVID vaccine stuff about like it's everything from people talking about like vaccine incidents and blood clots all the way up to like mind control and shit like that, all in varying levels of wrong. But like where's the fucking coordination for that? Like, do you think Fauci is sitting there with all the people who are making the vaccines like, all right guys, so here's what we need to do, we need this to both mind control and kill as many people as possible, but not so much that they notice it? And like, how do they coordinate this shit? Like, that's the thing about science, like you were saying, like there's always going to be a couple people who up because there are assholes everywhere, whether no matter what discipline they're in, there's going to be people who up or do things maliciously. But science is something that is beyond an individual. It is supposed to be a method of checks and balances to make sure that even if someone messes up, whether intentionally or by accident, it doesn't like carry over. Like if anyone along that way was like, holy shit, this vaccine has a very high possibility of killing a lot of people, they'd be like, stop the presses, we need to do this like right now. There is no way, even if one person in there was like, hey, the vaccine's gonna kill a lot of people, that goes on to the next guy who's like, holy shit, absolutely not, we're not fucking doing that.
Science is a process, and it's also a bunch of individuals too. I doubt you've been on many excavation sites or any excavation site where there's some guy there and he's like, man, I hate archaeology, but I'm doing this for whatever reason. Like the people that make it in these fields are probably people that like they were 4 years old at the museum digging up the play fossils or whatever. Like, these people have passion for this stuff. Totally. They really love it. They enjoy it. Like, where are all these malicious actors when they're 12 being groomed by like the evil society of bad doers? Where it's like, okay, you guys are all going to go start studying this so that you can all these trials up later on. Like,
so you can plant olive trees on Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah, Jesus.
When I look at a lot of this stuff, I'll probably take a pretty classical, like kind of psychological approach, like institutional distrust. When you ask the question, why would you trust Tim Pool and not like an institution? It's because you never actually have to like personally interact with Tim Pool, but you always have to interact with institutions. And institutions are inherently flawed because they're massive bureaucratic systems filled with people. And so everyone has had the experience of like going to like the DMV or like having to interface with some government agent and it being the worst experience of your life, right? Everyone has that experience of like just some bureaucrat being like, you know what? You particularly today, in a literal way where they're like, I don't want to sign your passport because you fucking annoy me. And then it's like your day's ruined, your week is ruined.
And so
sometimes your life is ruined.
And as the world gets more complicated, people have to interface even more with institutions than I think they had to in the past. And institutions are bigger than they ever have been. You know, like 100 years ago, you mostly just like had to go to your local doctor that you like walked or rode to. And he wasn't part of like the AHS, the Alberta Health Service, right? Whereas now in Alberta, it doesn't matter how rural you are, you're going to an AHS worker with AHS standards and institutions. And so anytime you get this negative exposure, you can't just be like, man, Dr. Smith sucks. You're like, AHS sucks.
And they're out to get you.
And they're out to get
And
you.
that's definitely true that people have those bad experiences. But what I wish more people would be aware about is your attention is being focused on these things that people don't want you to like. Because
and it reminds me of that world of pseudo-archaeology that I was bringing up, where it's the same kind of tropes over and over again that you're being driven towards. There's this kind of alternative world of facts, in a sense, and issues that you're just asking questions about that are being promoted to sort of divert your attention, I think is the right way to put it. To sort of get you to look somewhere else so that you don't see all the other stuff that's actually out there, right?
Yeah. And even when you were talking, because you were talking about like the mistrusting or distrust of like doctors or the Alberta Health Service, people will do this all the time where like, I don't want government bureaucracy, messing all this up. Like everybody knows the government bureaucrats are inefficient. The government's inefficient. And it's like, okay, who do you work for? And it'll be like some, massive software. Yeah. And I'm like, so tell me about your job. Like, are you going to tell me right now that you have the smooth, like, don't you guys complain about middle management, shitty employees, like all the time? I was like, yeah, I guess we do. Don't you complain about how you have to spend so much at the end of the quarter or else your budget's going to be fucked? I'm like, yeah, I guess we do. Don't you guys complain about like how stupid the boss? Okay. So it's not really the government. It's every kind of bureaucratic thing, but your attention is being focused in like such a way to uniquely hate like a particular thing. And it's like, I think it was with Flint where we talked about, or it might, where we talked about like if somebody was anti-vax, but they also like, they didn't eat any GMO crops. They didn't like their whole life. They worked out every single day. And it's like, okay, I get it. I think you're dumb, but at least I get it. You're not inconsistent.
We talked about that.
You're not inconsistent, right? Because every part of your life mirrors this. But when somebody says like, I'm super skeptical of all these institutions, I don't trust any of these people, but they will trust everything said by a certain government, a foreign government, everything said by their certain alternative media figures. It's like, okay, wait, so you do trust. You have a lot of trust, actually. You have actually far more trust in this institution, or in the institution being like this alternative media. You have so much more trust than I do. I don't trust, to be fair, I don't trust Pfizer. That's why I like the FDA. And I don't just trust the FDA. That's why we have two other branches of government. Yes. And I don't just trust the government. Yeah. That's why we vote
Checks
for them.
Balances.
Whereas you hear a thing from this media figure, Tim Pool, you trust everything he says implicitly, even though he might say the exact opposite thing 2 weeks from now. And I'm the one that's being suckered by big whatever. Like,
and you don't trust science, but what? You're using your phone, you're driving your car, you're doing all this other kind of stuff. Everything you do comes from this system that we live in. All the good and the bad, if you see what I mean. And so you can't just say, oh, it's all just the bad, I don't trust these people. What about all the good that you get from it? What about all the good that has come from scientific discovery and education and stuff like that, from what our government has done? I mean, Jesus, look at life expectancy today compared to 150 years ago. Look at the kind of fact that like fewer and fewer people are starving and malnourished in our country today than were 150 years ago.
But then they'll point out to you something, and again, I'm gonna be the populist here. Yes, okay. They'll point to you and be like, look at the suicide rates, So like, yeah, you're right. There's kind of this Maslow's issue of like, we aren't starving. There isn't really that much crime compared to before. And these things are valid. The issue is like the way the human brain system is set up isn't to like go around and be like, oh, it's so sunny out today. That's nice. It's like, God, is there a snake in the bush? That's like how our system is oriented because it's protective and adaptive. It's better for your brain to assume that there's malice and harmful things around you. And most importantly, like when you're saying like, why don't you just like think more about this? It's because most people just don't have the time or like the willfulness or the energy to, right? And like the reality is like they work 40 hours a week. They're exhausted. A lot of the work that they do is monotonous, empty work. So they're also like kind of like mentally and emotionally drained. And what they're looking for is like narratives that give them some level of meaning. And I think we see like different waves of narratives take shape all the time. And there's always going to be that group that's countercultural, whatever it is. In the 90s, it was like the punk rockers. But then like punk kind of became more mainstream and like now anime's mainstream. But before anime was kind of like counterculture and it's just the weird kids that did that stuff. And so you see like these ever evolving like shapes of like, we had like the rationalist skeptic movement that was very countercultural to the like kind of like big Christian that was going on in like the early 2000s. But now the rationalists and skeptics are hated by like the postmodernists and the red pill guys, right? And so it's like we see like these waves of narratives like moving in and out, and I see it as like people aren't like you know what, people are not, we said this I think yesterday, people aren't designed or created towards truth seeking. They're designed towards like more like truth seeking in a big T way of like narrative truths.
Yeah,
right.
the thing.
That's what our brains are really, really good at. And like, I don't really expect the guy who's like struggling to make rent. He's got 2 kids. They're just trying to get by. His mother-in-law is super annoying. He's depressed and sad all the time. His wife is on SSRIs. His kids are whiny. You know, I don't expect him to be like, like, how do I evaluate all these things in the world, even though I would really like him to do those things?
I think this is why I blame a lot of the alternative media stuff for the big media figures,
Yes.
because I think they do this. I think you can have these different views of life, but I mean, like, the issue I have right now is that as of recent, like, you can have like a positive ethos, you can have a negative ethos, and all of the alternative stuff just sell such a horribly negative ethos, and then we lose out on like all the like, you can have like, I would prefer even like a propaganda-rich environment where it's at least like good shit about our country, even if it is exaggerated. Like, I'd still prefer that to like everything has to be f***ing negative.
Yeah.
Like, we grew up with the thing where teachers say, like, you know, you're not gonna have a calculator in your pocket. Well, I have a supercomputer in my pocket that's more
What do you
powerful than the
mean?
collective compute power of the entire world when you were a kid. So right? That's really
like,
cool.
Hey Siri, what's the sin of 30 degrees or whatever?
Yeah, but we have no positive ethos right now.
I agree.
think.
And no good way to build community, which is what's so key. You know, we have to build community if we're going to ever deal with the challenges of this world. Again, it comes back to trust, right? You have to trust that we're going to build something that actually is successful because, you know, like I said, there's no linear progression of history. And that's because what happens in history is what people fucking do, right? And so what we are choosing to do right now is to not trust each other. And that is what we are choosing to do, and there's major repercussions for that we see all the time in political dysfunction, which therefore has other kinds of issues. And so, you know, in terms of what gets funded even. And so, you know, it all just comes down to how do we build a community that's stronger? And it's something me and Milo have been talking about a lot because we're like just last night when we were out for dinner, it's sort of like, look, we have these challenges of communicating archaeology with the public, and a lot of the public has been primed to distrust us, right? And so the only way to really combat that, let's say, is not to like go out and fight these people and debunk them and everything like that. What we need to do is build a stronger online community than they have built.
Yes.
Right? You know, an ecosystem of real archaeology that can kind of outswarm this kind of stuff. And we need to promote each other and push each other up so that we can start dominating these online algorithms in a different way than these other communities which have tried to dominate the online algorithms with distrust.
And be able to like take credit for things again.
Yeah.
Like, it's so frustrating. People are like, oh, you think climate change is real? Well, remember when smog was supposed to be a huge issue in LA? Remember when the ozone was a big deal? Remember when there was supposed to be acid rain?
Because they were
Where did those go?
solved.
Yeah, and it's like, what the
Like, people came together, they recognized the problem, and they did something about it.
It didn't just happen.
know?
Like you said, it didn't just, history is not inevitably tending towards positivity. It takes work.
And this is where you mentioned something. Ooh, big Florida rainstorm. Look at that. Gotta love it.
Oh, it's coming.
Oh, yeah.
Right down.
And this is something that we touched on earlier that I wanted to kind of circle back to. So I'm glad we are. You were talking about the idea of a generalist versus an expert. And Flint, I know you kind of gave your thoughts on that, and I kind of wanted to extrapolate on it a little bit.
Yeah, please.
I think that, in my opinion, having generalists and experts within the field is so important. I think that with having us, sitting at this table here, both of us have, our field that we are like specialized in on. Like you could say that I am like, no, I wouldn't say I'm an expert in archaeology, but that's my expertise. I'm an archaeologist, I'm an environmental scientist, but I am much more of a generalist in that field. I haven't declared what my specific thing is that I want to go into. I talked about that with all of you of like, I don't really know what I want my PhD to be yet. Like I'm really enjoying my communication side of things. Even if I did have a PhD, it would be in something so specific that I think I would have diminishing returns for how effectively I could communicate archaeology as a whole, even if it would give me some extra tools, where Flint is an expert. Like he has studied the thing that he is interested in and knows everything about it. And so you need both of those. You need the ability to communicate on both sides of that. And so that's something that I think is really important in this community that we are now trying to build, where like we want to have a lot of people in this who have these differing levels of expertise. Because like I think that having a generalist has been something which is almost like it feels insulting for me to even call myself that, because we see so many generalists. Yeah, because we see so many generalists who like are like just not doing any of the legwork, you know, where it's like being a generalist isn't a bad thing. Something I emphasize a lot is like, you know, if I had my PhD or something like that, I'd talk a lot about whatever my PhD is on, and I'd have a lot of, you know, my own research in it. But it's like, I'm not going out and doing digs right now. I'm not going to all the sites I talk about and gathering the research myself. I am taking the work of experts who have worked for years in the field to publish these papers and make these results available, and I digest it. I'm a generalist. I can go from part of the world to part of the world to part of the world. I can look at the different you know, evidence from there. I can call in experts who have more experience in the field than I do to like platform what they're saying, and by doing that I can kind of hop between places, which is the way the human mind wants to work. That's the way the audience wants to work. They, you know, if I made a whole channel where all I talked about was, I don't know, one particular type of stone tool from, you know, the Maine coast, it would be interesting and I'd get people in on it, but like eventually they're going to get tired of that one stone tool. So like, it's important that we have the ability to communicate all these different sites, bring in the specialists who are responsible for the data in those different sites, and really build out a community. Because the thing that the, you know, pseudo crowd really has, which, you know, to their credit, is they are pretty good at being self-referential. Like, they are very good at being able to just be like, hey, this guy who also says the same bullshit I do, you should go listen to what he has to say. And like, that's really the extent of it. Like, they aren't doing as much, you know, coordination as they probably could, but that works because it's an echo chamber already, so they kind of share audiences. But like the scientific community has had a really hard time translating to like the general audience, because it is something where like, because there's that stigma that you can't talk in the field unless you're an expert, but an expert spends so much time getting that one specific expertise that they then go in to teach that expertise to a classroom full of people at a university. They're never going to make a YouTube channel unless there's people like Flint who are getting out there and inspiring them to do that, and showing that there is classrooms of millions of people that we can now have online. So like, we need the people who are the generalists who can flit from site to site. We need the people who are the experts who have a deep breadth of archaeology, who can like talk about these sites in a much more critical, involved way than, you know, someone with just an armchair understanding of it. And so by doing that, I really hope that we can build out this community that is able to get out ahead of the pseudo archaeology. Because like I said yesterday, once you have to bring up Graham Hancock or any of these people, the damage is already done. You said the name. People who like Graham Hancock, maybe it'll change their mind. Both of us have had plenty of people who have come to us from our different series talking about, you know, his debate, my series, being like, wow, I never even thought about this. I've been fans of Graham for a long time, and I now kind of see the light. So it's possible, but once you bring up the name, like, it's going to be a cult of personality, and there's going to be people who just don't listen to you. So the thing that we need to do is we need to build out this community so that we can teach real stuff first. Just get it out there. Don't waste our time, you know, boxing with these people, as fun as that can be. And I think we still have to do that in a way, but like, you know, really prioritize just making sure there's good information out there, so everyone on their own, when Graham Hancock shows up on Netflix and he's there talking in his British accent, and, you know, he sounds like he really knows what he's doing, they can look and be like, huh, that dude's full of shit.
Yeah, just sorry. One last thing to add is what I got.
Please.
I fully think generalists are fantastic. I hope that did not come across.
Oh yeah, no
before.
way, no
I've
way.
worked with plenty of amateurs in the field. Right. And like I said, I've many amateurs have published in the field and stuff like that. And I also think there's plenty good generalists who are conveying archaeological information in an honest, truthful way, right? You know, they're expert communicators at synthesizing something complicated and making it understandable. And, you know, look, scholars are generalists too, though. We have to be when we teach, right? When we're teaching an introductory to archaeology course, I'm not teaching about animal bones and ancient Greece. I'm teaching about other stuff, right? When I went on Joe Rogan to do that, I had to talk to 20 other experts to be able to synthesize the material that they gave me for a general public. And we do that. And one of the things that I've found since I started engaging with the public a few years ago on Twitter and then now on YouTube and stuff like that, is as an expert, one of the cool things that I can do is I can signpost for people that are not experts sort of how to approach some of these complex topics, right? And so like I brought up, I think yesterday, the example of Homo naledi and whether they buried their dead. And when I made that video, it was really my own. I was going on a limb and doing my own peer review of it. And other YouTubers who had praised that publication, they saw my video and then they were like, oh, wow, wait a second. And they made new videos that changed their narrative, right? And when I do stuff like I made this video about Göbekli Tepe to deal with some of this conspiracy theory stuff, and it's already in the newspaper because I have all these journalists that follow me on Twitter. And so it's like, you know, as an expert, if you speak to the public, you have a certain ability to really shift the narrative that's happening around you, because other people who are really good at communication, whether it's journalists or podcasters or YouTubers or whatever, you guys listen to experts and then you guys think think through, how am I going to apply that for my audience? And so it's why I think experts have to speak up so much, because we can really signpost how to get this stuff out, and then other people can take it and run with it, if you see what I mean. And it's so valuable to be able to do that and seeing that impact. It's so empowering to keep doing that and to really try to explain to my colleagues how we can impact this narrative just by speaking up.
Yeah, I think I would say like two things to that, and then obviously we can wrap because I don't want to keep going on and on and on and on. One, sometimes I wonder though if, Flint, you have a bit of a survivor bias, because I think you're really naturally talented at converting your expertise into accessible ways. Like there's a reason why you, compared to almost any other like not very known expert, got on Joe Rogan and kind of took down like Graham Hancock, right? There's not a lot of experts that have done that. And it's not obvious to me that all can, because I think a lot of the zeitgeist within academic expertise especially is that you're an expert, that you aren't a generalist. And there oftentimes is this resistance. And even like sometimes it's not even resistance, sometimes it's just lack of skill. Some people are just not good at this. They're not good at science communication necessarily, right? They're like, I don't want to have to figure out a simpler way to explain like isotopes and all the, I don't want to figure it out. Like, I don't care, you know, you guys, I just want to be an expert. And so it's like, I would agree. It seems like you have like the tactical skill being both an expert and a generalist. I just think that we shouldn't assume that like all experts can become those generalists. It would be, what's really cool is that tying that you see of like experts finding people who are the good, more generalist science communicator, jack of all trades type person, connecting to them. Like Crash Course is a really good example of, they get in touch with experts. The experts help them build their entire script. But then it's Hank and John who are presenting it all the time. Hank is not like an expert of every single crash course that they've ever done, but they've had experts vet it, and then they go and do their own skill of presenting it, which in many ways they're kind of like their own expert. So yeah, I guess I would just say that of being like,
I fully agree. Not everybody is able to do that, but I also think, I'm sure Milo knows, he's had a lot of archaeology professors or listened to lectures by archaeologists. Archaeologists can be very engaging people. You know, we have all kinds of crazy stories. When an archaeologist is at a dinner party, go talk to that archaeologist.
Yeah.
We have stories about getting electrocuted on cattle fences. We have stories about getting robbed in the field. We have stories of goats, mysterious goats that approach us with buckets on their heads. You know, like doing archaeology, especially if you travel around the world to do it, you need to become somewhat of an expert at communication, because you're communicating in different languages and across different cultural divides. And so while I'm not saying everybody can do that well, that's not my point. There's a lot of us that really can.
And we need to tap into it.
Yeah.
That's the thing, is really, it's like the communicators are already out there. Like, it's not even a question of like, you know, maybe on an individual basis, it could be teaching some how to, you know, communicate a little better. But like the archaeologists are already great communicators as far as I've seen. It's just using this platform and this medium. Like, we need to translate that communication that happens in the classroom, that happens in the field and at the dinner parties, onto YouTube, onto the internet. And I mean, that's what we're doing here. I mean, this is already really big. It was so inspiring for me as someone who, like, you know, has spent a long time kind of building up the channel that I have, to see Flint enter the field in his debate with Graham. That was like the first time I really like heard about Flint, and he was put on my radar, and like he aced it. It was awesome. And I'm like, shit, we need people like this in this field. Cause like I do it, but as the generalist, I'm like, I want the experts too. Like, I can't just be the only one like shouldering archaeology. Not that I'm the only one. There's plenty of amazing creators who are, you know, with me in this community, but I'm like, we need, like, there should be way more people with the expertise that Flint has, that other creators have, to be there and tell what they have to, you know, what they've studied, because they know this shit, you know?
I say that same thing a lot. Yeah, like, why the fuck am I arguing over antibody-dependent enhancement on vaccine shit? Like, can there please just be like an immunologist or somebody, or a virologist that just comes out because me, dude? Like,
I said that in one of my recent debunked videos, talking about, you know, like the pyramid power plant, and like he was like, oh well, there's no carvings on the inside of the pyramid, so it couldn't have been a burial structure. And I'm like, I'm not an Egyptologist, but now I'm gonna have to pretend to know the cultural practices around putting carvings in a pyramid, because you're gonna generalize. Like, god damn, that's not my field. I don't know this shit, man. You know? So
yeah.
All right, where do people find you? What do they look up?
Well, I'm MILO ROSSI, MiniMinuteMan on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. But the one that you really want to check out is this guy over here, Flint. Flint's he's a newcomer in the space. We gotta Get him up there.
Thank you, Milo. I don't have your sort of voice to that. Well, I'm Flint Dibble.
That's pretty
I'm
good.
an archaeologist, and no, you can find me. I mostly do my public communication on Twitter and YouTube with my name, Flint Dibble. And but you can find me on other social media as well, where I try to advertise that stuff. And I'm trying to do a lot more YouTubing because I think that, I think the way to teach archaeology is with images, right? You got to show people what we have, show them the truth, and then come out to a dig and feel the truth, right? You know, hold an artifact in your hand. I think that's really important. And so, yeah, find me online, YouTube, Twitter, things like that.
And this is just the beginning. You just watch yourself.
We have formed an alliance.
We have formed an alliance. Oh, man.
That's awesome. Well, thank you guys for coming out. It was a lot of content in 2 days.
Oh, yeah.
So
It
I
was.
appreciate it.
Oh, yeah.
I'm excited for this alliance that I'm going to, where Bridge is going to take sole credit. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Where do we sign?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the real exciting thing is now that you're both quasi online, well, you're a very online figure and you're working your way. Yeah, eventually there's going to be the big bridge burning where you guys backstab each other. And
Dude, I'm stoked. We should start planning that now. Yeah,
I'm going to use a stone tool to stab you.
Flint, hopefully.
Yeah, check them out if you guys want to check out any of them out. I'm sure there's multiple ways to support them. If you like Bridges and you want to support the show, make sure you check out our Patreon. We're working on getting some behind the scenes footage up and all sorts of goodies there, as well as asking future guests questions that will be answered every episode. So make sure to check that out.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
Woo! Thank you guys.
Let's go,
Yeah.
y'all. Nice work.
The news is divided. Ground news puts it back together. So you can see how many sources are reporting on any breaking story, where they fall on the political spectrum, how reliable they are, and who owns them. Compare headlines and read full articles to see which details are prioritized, exaggerated, or left out entirely. Because the more we understand the media, the more we'll understand each other. Visit ground.news to learn more.